Timeless Assassin by Raj_Shah_7152. Chapter 841-870. Chapter 841 The Serpent Still Breathes. Meanwhile inside Skyshard City, the Third Elder's POV. For the better part of 25 years, ever since the cult elders retreated into the time-stilled world under Leo's new regime, the Third Elder had lived like a decorative relic rather than a ruler, as the influence he once wielded over cities, people, and military commands had been stripped from him piece by piece until nothing remained but a hollow title with no teeth and no authority. Chaosbringer had orchestrated the dismantling with surgical precision, while Leo's silent endorsement ensured that not a single elder could protest without being crushed beneath the shadow of the Shadow Dragon's rise, leaving the Third Elder to observe helplessly as the power structure he had built over centuries collapsed into dust around him. Yet despite losing his influence, he did not lose his ambition, for deep inside him there lurked a patient serpent that refused to die, coiling tighter over the decades as he waited for the slightest opening, any sliver of opportunity that might slip through the cracks of Chaosbringer's tight surveillance. He had always been a righteous faction asset, long before Leo was even born, long before Commander Charles's death, long before the cult had crowned their newest dragon Aegon Vare, as it was he who leaked classified council decisions to the righteous faction each year, and it was he who betrayed the previous dragon Noah by revealing his location during a time of war. However, after retreating into the stilled world, that connection he had with the righteous faction was severed entirely, as for the first time in his life he found himself trapped, monitored, and powerless, surrounded by devoted loyalists who reported even his smallest requests to Chaosbringer as though he were a dangerous prisoner rather than an esteemed elder. It took him 25 long years of suffocating silence before he could finally carve open a hole in the net cast around him, as he played the long game and cultivated fresh assets from the ground up by raising young orphan boys like a benevolent guardian, guiding them into professions that would eventually place them in strategic positions beneficial to him. One such asset was a young boy he had groomed since the age of 3, who had eventually become a cult pilot trusted with flying in and out of the stilled world twice a day to relay messages to the outside world. As it was through him that the Third Elder finally managed to make contact with the righteous faction once again. The poor boy, who trusted him like a father, had no idea that the messaging relay he slipped onto the craft each day was not for a cult mission, nor for any noble purpose or the greater good, but rather for contacting the righteous faction, as the Third Elder used him like a pawn without hesitation. Once that connection was restored, the Third Elder re-established communication with his old acquaintances in the righteous faction one message at a time, until the channel fully reopened and began flowing freely once more. Slowly but surely, information once again moved between the righteous faction and the hidden traitor living comfortably within the cult's most secure world. As the Third Elder learned of Leo's attacks on fortified righteous planets, the unexpected return of Soren, and many other developments that had been concealed from him for far too long. In return, he informed the righteous faction about the technological advancements the cult had achieved, how they were thriving within the stilled world, and how an inevitable war was approaching, as even without access to top-secret military details he remained perceptive enough to read the shifting currents and warn his counterparts accordingly. These fluctuations in the air I felt today, it's highly likely that Skyshard has broken through to Monarch. The Third Elder whispered, deciding that this would be the message he sent out today, as he picked up an encrypted crystal and spoke softly into the recorder before activating the hidden relay embedded within the pilot's shuttle, allowing the message to ride out unnoticed alongside his asset's craft, only to be delivered to his counterparts once the shuttle exited the stilled world and re-entered the wider universe. You have made a big mistake by making us elders toothless, Skyshard. For it is not just me who is ready to betray the cult now, but rather many more among the council who are prepared to join my side. With Soren back, I simply need to start stirring trouble for you, for if the true cult master has returned, then you no longer possess even an ounce of legitimate authority as the temporary sect master. And once that becomes public knowledge, we can demand an audience with our Lord. The Third Elder mused, as he began quietly assembling the resurgence of the council inside his own mind, weaving together the threads of suspicion, resentment, and ambition that had simmered among the elders for decades without an outlet. He knew very well that Chaosbringer had crushed their influence, dismantled their networks, stripped away their forces, and reduced them to ceremonial figureheads, yet he also knew that old power never truly disappeared but merely lay dormant, waiting for the right spark to reignite the flames of rebellion. All he needed now was a catalyst. And Soren's return was that catalyst. If the true cult master lived, then the elders had every right, no, the obligation to reassert themselves as the governing council beneath him, allowing the third elder to resurrect the power they once commanded while painting his actions as a righteous correction rather than treason. He envisioned rallying the remaining elders one by one, whispering doubts about Chaosbringer's intentions, feeding fears that Leo would continue to monopolize authority, and promising them restoration of their lost privileges once the hierarchy was rebalanced under Soren's banner. And when the righteous faction finally struck once Leo and Soren both fell, he would be the one offering the most cooperation, the one presenting himself as the bridge between invaders and the conquered, the loyal administrator who had risked everything to assist them from within. In exchange, he murmured softly, almost lovingly, they will make me caretaker of all cult lands, ruler of the remnants, steward of whatever remains after the purge. He smiled thinly at the thought, his eyes reflecting a cold ambition that had survived decades of suffocation, as he imagined the council restored, the righteous faction victorious, and himself seated atop the ruins as the sole remaining authority. And when the smoke clears, I will finally get what I deserve, the third elder whispered, already savoring the future he believed was now within reach. Chapter 842 The Old Guard. The next night, Skyshard City, the Eighth Elder's POV. The night hung heavy over Skyshard City as the Eighth Elder slipped quietly out through the rear window of a small restaurant bathroom, his cloak drawn tight around his shoulders while he merged into the darkness of the alleys with practiced ease, for although he was an elder of the cult, he had long grown accustomed to living like a fugitive within his own homeland, ever since Chaosbringer's relentless watch tightened around all of them. He moved swiftly and silently through the backstreets, keeping his head lowered and his steps light, avoiding lit paths and circling behind closed shops, relying on memory and instinct more than sight as he made his way toward the designated meeting point, praying that none of Chaosbringer's watchers had taken an interest in his unusual route tonight. By the time he reached the old metallic gate at the outskirts of the district, his heartbeat had already picked up in pace, not out of fear of battle, but out of the dread that he would be discovered during a secret gathering such as this, and his freedom would be culled even further. Knock, knock. He knocked twice, then placed his palm against the cold steel before murmuring softly through the slit in the door. Long live the old order, long live the Council of Elders. As, click, the gate unlocked with a metallic click, sliding open just enough to allow him inside before sealing shut behind him with quiet finality, as the Eighth Elder stepped into the dim warehouse where the others were already gathered. The First Elder, the Third Elder, the Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, 10th and 11th Elders. All present, all masked by the same exhaustion, frustration and simmering resentment that he himself carried. Lord Eighth, the Third Elder greeted mockingly from across the table, his eyes glinting with a sly amusement that made the Eighth Elder's jaw tighten. How have you been? I've been the same as the rest of us, Lord Third, Toothless. The Eighth Elder said, his voice sharp with bitterness as he took a seat, for the humiliation of living like a ceremonial relic while Leo and Chaosbringer controlled every aspect of cult governance had long since worn away whatever patience he once possessed. Well, don't be so disappointed, Lord Eighth, the Third Elder replied smoothly, leaning back in his chair with the air of a man who knew more than the rest of them. I come bearing some good news tonight. Before the Eighth Elder could respond, the First Elder scoffed loudly, his expression twisted with barely controlled fury as he slammed his palm against the table. Unless the news you're about to give is that the traitorous Seventh Elder is dead, he growled, I'm not interested in anything else. His knuckles turned white from how tightly his fists clenched, the veins rising across his forearm as he fought to contain the hatred that had long festered in him toward Chaosbringer. No, that's not what I have to say. The Third Elder answered calmly, lowering his voice until everyone leaned in closer, their eyes narrowing as anticipation pooled between them like a gathering storm. But what I do have to share, he continued, letting the silence stretch just long enough to tighten every elder's nerves, is that Lord Soren is alive, and that he's back on Ixtal. Gasp. Gasps echoed across the room. The First Elder froze. The Fourth Elder's hands trembled. Even the stoic 10th Elder leaned forward with rare urgency. Skyshard has been hiding this information from us, the Third Elder said slowly, savoring their reactions, but I've learned the truth through my sources. He shared as a spark ignited in their eyes a hope, a possibility, a seismic shift neither Leo nor Chaosbringer had wanted them to imagine. For the implication was clear. If Soren was alive, then Leo was no longer the legitimate sect master. The elders stared at one another as the realization settled like thunder in their bones. A restless murmur spread through the room as the elders exchanged glances, each man feeling the weight of the moment press against his chest, for the return of Soren was not merely good news, it was an earthquake capable of toppling Leo's iron rule in a single stroke if handled correctly. The fourth elder leaned forward first, his voice trembling with barely contained excitement as he whispered, "If Lord Soren lives, then Skyshard's authority ends today. We were supposed to follow him only until our real sect master returned." "Yes," the sixth elder added quickly, his eyes alight with the thrill of long-buried ambition resurfacing, "and if Soren is back on Ixtal, then the first thing the cult should do is reinstate the council, not bow to a boy who seized power through Charles's death." A few heads nodded at once. The fifth elder spoke next, his voice low yet sharp with purpose. "Skyshard hid this from us, which means he fears what Lord Soren's return means for him. That secrecy alone proves that he has no intention of relinquishing his control willingly." "That settles it then," the first elder muttered, his earlier fury replaced by cold determination as he clasped his hands together. "The people must know. If we release this news to the public, the masses will demand what is rightfully theirs, a proper sect master, not a temporary figurehead clinging to power." The 11th elder shot a wary glance at the door before speaking. "If the civilians hear Lord Soren has returned, they will support our demand to have an audience with the Lord at the least. I don't think the 7th will be able to stop us from going out then." "Exactly," the third elder said smoothly, his gaze sweeping across the table as he steered their excitement into a unified plan. "So we let the truth leak carefully, quietly, through the common folk who still revere the elders. Rumors will spread like wildfire, and by the time the 7th even realizes what is happening, the city will already be demanding us to let him meet the Lord." A dangerous, eager silence filled the air. The first elder clenched his fist as a fierce smile tugged at his mouth. "Then it's decided, the old order returns. And Skyshard's reign ends." One by one, the elders nodded, their resentment transforming into resolve, unaware that the serpent among them, the third elder, smiled for reasons far darker than theirs. Chapter 843. It's over. A couple days later, Skyshard City, a common citizen's POV. By the time a few days had passed, the rumor had already begun to spread, whispered from market stalls to shuttle queues, drifting through blacksmith forges and drifting across cafe counters, as snippets of Soren, alive, slipped through the streets exactly as the elders intended, yet the reaction that followed was nothing like the uprising the council had envisioned. Most citizens simply smiled at the rumor, feeling happy that their lord might finally be back before brushing it aside like dust on their sleeves, continuing with their morning chores as though nothing meaningful had been said at all, as if Lord Soren's return, something once sacred enough to mobilize armies, had suddenly become irrelevant compared to the life they had now inside this stilled world. And when someone finally dared to tug at a neighbor's sleeve and mutter something along the lines of, "Maybe this means the shadow dragon should step down," the reaction was immediate and sharp. "Are you crazy, man?" a butcher snapped as he slammed his cleaver onto the chopping block, startling a line of waiting customers. "Why would any sane person want Lord Shadow Dragon replaced? What hasn't he done for us?" he asked, as a woman in the queue nodded vigorously, pulling her son closer to her side. "Yeah, behave. Lord Skyshard is the reason we're thriving in the stilled world. Without him we would all be dead by now." "Dead. Where is your gratitude?" she asked, as even the elderly, who once lived on Ixtal, simply sighed and waved away the rumor with tired amusement. Kids these days, always believing nonsense. If Lord Soren was truly back, Lord Skyshard would be the first one to tell us. "There's no infighting within the cult. The righteous are the enemy," he said, as unlike what the elders wanted, nobody demanded for Leo to step down. However, as if that was not bad enough, the even worse part was that no one mentioned the elders at all. Not once. Not directly. Not even by accident. Instead, every irritated remark, every defensive comment, every annoyed dismissal was directed at a vague, "someone stirring trouble," or "idiot spreading discord," as the implication behind their voices was unmistakable, that whoever wanted Leo gone was a fool. Street by street, stall by stall, Workshop by workshop, the reaction across the stilled world was the same. Dismissive, annoyed, protective of Leo, utterly uninterested in replacing him with anyone else, not even Soren himself. In fact, more than a few commoners puffed their chests and declared boldly, if Lord Soren really returned, then he should come here to the stilled world and resume control of the cult, not the other way around. Exactly. Who do people think built our fleets, our economy, our safety? Lord Skyshard did. Our lives here are much better than out in the normal universe, and it's all because of him. They said, as some laughed, some cursed, some rolled their eyes, but none supported the idea of the elders returning, none even believed they should have a say. As in the end, the elders, grand spark of rebellion. Their carefully laid rumor network. Their secret plan to stir the masses. All fell flat in a matter of days, drowned beneath the blind loyalty and gratitude the people held toward Leo, who had kept them alive, safe, prosperous, and armed while the universe outside tried to annihilate them again and again. As by the third day, the sentiment across Skyshard City was so uniform, so ironclad, that anyone still trying to push the rumor found themselves mocked in alleys and stared at with suspicion in public squares. The coup had failed before it even began. The commoners had spoken, and they had chosen their shadow dragon, which left the elders in an extremely awkward position. Black magic, the eighth elder yelled, as he pulled at his own hair in sheer disbelief, pacing back and forth inside the hidden warehouse where the council had reconvened, his voice echoing off the metal walls as though the room itself mocked his frustration. It's like he has cast black magic over the entire population. Not a single one of them questioned him, not a single one demanded the council return, not even a whisper of resistance, nothing. He cried, as the fifth elder slumped helplessly into his chair, burying his face in both hands, his shoulders shaking with a bitterness that soured into something close to despair. For 25 years of humiliation had already stretched them thin, but this final rejection from the people felt like the world spitting directly in their faces. Across the table, the first elder's jaw flexed repeatedly as he ground his teeth hard enough that the veins across his temple bulged, his eyes dark with the realization he had spent decades refusing to accept. It's over, he muttered quietly, as though saying the words physically hurt him. The people, they don't want us anymore. A heavy silence fell, not the tense silence of plotting, not the sharp silence of anger, but the hollow, resigned silence of men who had finally understood that history had already moved past them. The fourth elder exhaled slowly and leaned back, staring up at the ceiling as though searching for answers in old memories that no longer meant anything. They don't even remember what the old order was like, he murmured bitterly. To them, Leo Skyshard is the cult. Not us. Not the council. Not the elders. The sixth elder shook his head, defeated. Even Lord Soren's name wasn't enough, imagine that. The greatest sect master in our history returns, and the people still choose the shadow dragon without hesitation. And why wouldn't they? The 10th elder added in a low voice, his fingers slowly tracing the rim of his cup as though trying to steady himself. He is the one who saved them. He is the one who fed them. He is the one who built the ships, raised the walls, armed the cities. We didn't do any of that. They owe him everything. A painful truth, spoken aloud at last, hung in the air between them. Leo had not taken the cult by force. He had taken it by loyalty. By results. By undeniable, overwhelming merit. Which was why he had now become impossible to overthrow. Chapter 844 Verdict. Leo's isolated mansion, the time-stilled world, Chaosbringer's POV. The tension in the room was thick enough to be sliced with a knife, as Chaosbringer and Leo sat across from one another with passive-aggressive smiles tugging at their lips, the kind of smiles shared only by men who trusted each other absolutely yet still recognized the sheer danger both were capable of unleashing, as the soft glow of the mansion's lanterns washed over their faces and highlighted the silent killing intent stirring inside both. Chaosbringer rested his gloved hands atop the table, leaning forward enough to signal respect without diminishing his own anger about the matter, as he spoke in an icy cold tone. My lord, there has been an attempt by the Elders' Council, at least that is my strongest assumption, to stir the public sentiment against you, a small push to make you appear as an illegitimate sect master now that God Soren has returned, as if your authority was meant to expire the moment the true cult master breathed again. Chaosbringer began, as he bared his teeth in anger, while Leo arched a brow with an amused calm, swirling his cup lightly as though this political treachery were nothing more than gossip from the marketplace, yet the faint curl at the corner of his mouth betrayed the coldness simmering beneath his surface. But their attempt failed. Chaosbringer continued, allowing himself a small smirk as he reported the matter, and not simply failed, my lord, it collapsed so spectacularly that the common people did not even bother to entertain the idea, choosing instead to defend you with a loyalty I have not seen since the uprising, as they dismissed the rumor entirely and instead directed their irritation toward the ones trying to stir discord. Chaosbringer shared, as Leo set his cup down gently, the porcelain clicking against the table in a soft note, as he tilted his head in a mixture of satisfaction and contemplation, his gaze sharpening while his smile remained eerily relaxed. Still, Chaosbringer added, his tone dropping lower as he folded his hands before him, we must not take this lightly, for this event confirms that at least one elder possesses access to information they should not have, especially since the fact that God Soren has returned is known only to a very limited number of people, which means someone, somewhere, has re-established contact with the outside world. Leo exhaled a slow breath, the sound almost a sigh yet far too controlled to be called exhaustion, as he leaned back against the throne and let his eyes drift upward for a moment, as if contemplating how many opportunities he had given the elders before arriving at the inevitable conclusion. Well, he began softly, his voice steady and dangerously reasonable, I had hoped that bringing the elders into the stilled world would slowly dissolve their ego, that time and isolation would grind their ambitions down until they posed no real threat, and that I would never have to resort to eliminating them outright, yet this little stunt proves something I should have remembered from the beginning. He paused, his eyes narrowing with a hint of predatory intent as the temperature in the room seemed to drop ever so slightly. Sparing snakes, he said quietly, is never a long-term solution, for they always find a way to grow fangs again. Chaosbringer's smile widened in approval, for nothing pleased him more than hearing his lord embrace the ruthless logic necessary for true leadership, a logic Chaosbringer himself had lived by since his days serving Leo in the Uprising Guild. I'll let you handle this. Leo continued, his tone steady as though he were delegating a minor administrative task rather than ordering the dismantling of the last great political threat within the cult. Find out how they re-established communication with the outside universe and sever it completely, and if necessary, deal with the elders accordingly. He instructed, as his gaze sharpened, his smile still unwavering. Within the next couple of years, make them die natural deaths in the cold of night, one after another, until the entire council is gone. Make every incident appear genuine and unavoidable, and when the time comes, even hold public funerals, allowing the citizens to express gratitude for the elders' long service while never suspecting that their quiet deaths were intentional. Leo instructed before grunting, as he shook his head in disappointment. One way or another, it's time for the elders' council to finally rest in peace. He ordered, as Chaosbringer felt his blood rush with a thrill he had not experienced in years, for these were orders tailor-made for someone like him, delicate and brutal in equal measure, requiring a blend of precision, patience, and cruelty that he excelled in. It shall be done, my lord, he replied, bowing his head respectfully even as his grin broadened in barely disguised excitement. I will trace their connection to the outside world, determine whether we can exploit it to our advantage, and once its usefulness ends, I will eliminate every last elder as you please. His voice softened, reverent and confident. Within 2 years, not a single one will remain, he claimed, as Leo nodded with calm approval, though the light in his eyes hinted at deeper thoughts. I will be gone for a couple of years, Chaosbringer. Leo announced, his tone casual yet heavy with implication. I will train on the floating island we discovered a few years ago where the ancient dragon lives. I have some unfinished business with him. But by the time I return, I expect this elder situation to be dealt with. He instructed, as he brushed a hand through the air, feeling the surrounding mana swirl gently around him as if greeting its new master. For now, I'll wait for my realm to stabilize fully before beginning that grueling training, but once I do, the era of holding back will end, and it will be time for me to lead the cult's forces back into the wider universe. He paused, his voice dropping just slightly. We will try to save there. He shared, as Chaosbringer bowed deeply, his face solemn as he absorbed the weight of that mission and promise. Everything will be arranged, my lord, Chaosbringer assured, maintaining his respectful posture even as excitement simmered beneath his calm exterior. Train without worry. Issues of this level are beneath your attention, leave them to me, he said, as Leo's smile softened once more. Leo knew Chaosbringer would execute this task with the same cold, meticulous perfection that defined every mission he undertook, which freed Leo from even entertaining the issue any longer, trusting fully in the outcome. Chapter 845 Leo seeks Moltheric. A few days later, the time-stilled world, Leo's POV. It took a few days for Leo to fully adjust to the changes in his new body, as he spent that time familiarizing himself with the enhanced strength, smoother mana circulation, and greater stability that came with ascension, until eventually he reached a point where every movement felt natural again and his confidence in his combat ability returned completely. Only after achieving that state did he set out to meet Moltheric, whereby this time he no longer needed a transport craft to get there, as unlike before, he no longer needed assistance for flying. Thud. Leo landed on the ancient floating island without hesitation, touching down with a steady smile as he walked toward the central chamber where Moltheric's soul usually rested, his steps relaxed now that he no longer felt out of sync with his own power. Push. He pressed open the massive doors to the chamber, the panels sliding aside with a heavy echo as he stepped inside, only to find Moltheric already awake in the form of a towering red dragon, observing him with calm and curious golden eyes. Boy, you are back, and you have somehow learned to contain the unrest in your aura. Moltheric observed quietly, his gaze assessing every detail of Leo's posture and mana flow as Leo returned the look with a confident smile, pleased that the ancient dragon noticed the improvement in him immediately. Yeah, it was a long and arduous road toward becoming a monarch, but somehow I made it all the way, he replied, as Moltheric's gaze sharpened ever so slightly. I felt your unstable aura when you ascended, boy. It was quite strong. Moltheric noted, his tone measured and neutral, neither mocking nor praiseful, as he simply stated what he sensed with clarity. But just to be sure, let me feel it once again. Hit me with the strongest killing intent you can muster. Let us see what you truly hold now, Moltheric instructed, as Leo smirked at the request, bending his knees slightly as his expression sharpened in tandem with the surge rising within him. All right, you asked for it, he said, before releasing his killing intent in its entirety as the floating island trembled beneath the weight of what poured out of him. Tremble. The chamber quivered as his killing intent erupted outward like a tidal wave of bloodlust, heavy enough to warp the edges of the room while the air groaned under a force far too colossal for any normal mortal to withstand. TRR. TRR. If not for the ancient enchantments anchored deep beneath the island, the stone floor beneath him would have splintered instantly, cracking apart like brittle glass under a hammer, for no ordinary ground could have endured the brutality of what he released. However, thankfully, the floating island was a special structure that was designed to withstand even Moltheric's aura, which made Leo's effort feel light in comparison. Whoosh. Nonetheless, although not as powerful as Moltheric's aura, his killing intent still bellowed in a deep crimson shade around him, as it pulsed and weaved with the lethality of something that should not belong to a mere monarch. What insane strength, Moltheric noted without blinking, his golden eyes reflecting the red haze as it crashed against his colossal soul form. Outwardly he remained indifferent, unmoving, his expression placid and bored. Yet inwardly something stirred. For the first time in thousands of years he felt a quiet jolt of excitement rising through his ancient consciousness, as he couldn't help but acknowledge Leo for the genius he was. This is not the aura of a nascent soul, he thought silently, as a rare pulse of disbelief flickered through his mind. This is the killing aura of a calamity, maybe of a berserk dragon who has already erased many worlds, he thought, as he felt an old instinct rise from a distant past where such beings had roamed the stars freely. Still, he let none of that show on his face, as he swallowed the reaction with the practiced discipline of a being who once stood at the peak of cosmic battlefields. As only when Leo had finally reined the aura back in, compressing the crimson storm into the quiet hum within his chest, did Moltheric incline his head in a slow, steady gesture. Just as I expected, he said calmly, though a faint glimmer passed through his eyes as he recalculated his understanding of the boy, you have strengthened your killing intent manifold. His long tail curled slightly behind him, a subtle sign of unease only a dragon would recognize, as he studied Leo with renewed scrutiny. But what I do not understand, Multheric continued, his tone turning sharper with genuine curiosity, is how you manage this in such a short span of time. Killing intent of this depth does not grow through effort. It is forged through slaughter, through extinction, through the taking of billions of lives. He let the words hang in the air, tasting them, as if trying to match Leo to a category that no longer existed. As Leo chuckled at the comment, before rubbing the back of his head as though brushing off something trivial. Well, he said lightly, grinning at the ancient dragon's scrutiny, about that part. I may or may not have gone on a rather extensive killing spree recently, he admitted, as Multherac's eyes narrowed, the golden glow in them sharpening. How extensive? He asked, as Leo exhaled softly before folding his arms, as he spoke with a casual honesty that made the words feel even heavier. Rough estimate. Around 2 billion enemy soldiers. Maybe a little more, depending on how you count the ones who died from the collateral damage. He said, as Multherac's pupils contracted ever so slightly, the dragon falling silent as he processed the scale, while Leo shrugged with a faint, unapologetic smile. That probably explains the killing intent. I mean, I took your advice on how to strengthen my aura and decided to become a true galactic killer, he said, as Multheric looked at him like he was some sort of a freak. I told you to go on such adventures after you're a king-level warrior. Not a mere nascent soul, he thought, as he shivered just thinking about how Leo had killed 2 billion enemies at such a low tier. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And please support the author by link in description. Chapter 846 Space Travel. So, I'm assuming that you have come here to learn the ancient transportation technique. Multheric said, as Leo nodded calmly in response. His entire strategy to save Vare relied on this special space tunneling technique that would help him lead his army straight into the heart of the battlefield, bypassing the need for transportation crafts, as without doing so half his army would most likely die pointless deaths before ever getting a chance to land on the surface of the pit. Before we begin, I must warn you, boy, that this method is ideally made for king-level warriors, and that the strain it will put on your being will be unlike anything you have experienced before. You will feel as if your body is being torn apart by spatial currents on all sides, and you will struggle just to maintain lucidity of thought. Multheric warned, as his ancient golden eyes constricted slightly, his face turning tense as he tried to see whether Leo felt any hesitation at all. Imagine having your arms and legs chained to 4 wild rhinoceros. Now imagine those rhinoceros running in 4 different directions as your body is stretched and split apart from the middle. Now 10,000-fold that pain, as you would not feel a pull in just 4 directions but rather every direction possible, with the intensity of that pull rising and falling constantly as you move through space. Multheric warned, as Leo winced slightly just imagining such a brutal form of travel. The rational part of his brain did not want him subjected to that kind of pain, while the logical part still whispered, you have no other choice. As sighing deeply, Leo resigned himself to the fate that awaited him. Well, you can warn me all you want, but it's not like I have another choice. It's either learn this method and try to save Vare, or give up and let him die. And I'm not willing to let my brother die without trying, so no matter the difficulty, I'm ready to learn. Leo replied, as Multheric nodded in approval. One needed such firm willpower to survive this method as a monarch-tier practitioner, and since Leo possessed it, Multheric decided to begin the actual training. I will impart the basics of this method to you in stages. And the first stage is learning how to create an aura shield. Multheric began, as he unleashed a sliver of his true aura before wrapping it around his body like a tight blanket, the crimson glow tightening gradually until it settled against his scales like a dense second skin. This is an aura shield, a technique where the same killing intent you currently use to suppress others and assert dominance is forced into a defensive state by layering it around your body like a thick blanket capable of withstanding immense external pressure without collapsing. Multheric explained as he stepped forward slowly, allowing Leo to observe how the shimmering layer clung to his massive form with the natural ease of true skin, as it shifted with every subtle movement while radiating a fortified depth that could endure aura pressure from warriors far above Leo's realm. Extending your killing intent outward to intimidate or overwhelm is something even talented children can manage instinctively. However, wrapping that same aura around yourself for defense is something far more complex. Multharic continued, his gaze sharpening as the crimson light rippled across the chamber walls, because killing intent exists to dominate and destroy, not to protect, so forcing it to spread thin around your body and maintain shape is asking it to act against its very nature. Multharic reasoned, as Leo narrowed his eyes at this explanation, the gears in his head turning at full speed as he absorbed this knowledge like a sponge. That is why only warriors with elite-level aura control can manage this, because to create an aura shield, you need to force your aura to defy its base nature, which is a feat only a very few can perform. Multharic said, his tail sweeping across the stone floor in a slow arc as he studied Leo's expression carefully. All beings, whether mortal or immortal, possess a survival reflex where their aura surges violently when sensing danger, as it rises to clash with the threat head-on. However, that instinct is like trying to fight fire with fire, or like trying to counter a water jet coming your way by releasing another in its direction. Multharic said, as Leo imagined a picture of two water jets colliding in his head. But what we aim to achieve is the opposite, since we are trying to stop a water jet with a water wall. Something stable and reinforced rather than explosive and reactive, which requires overriding your base instinct completely. He explained, as he tapped his claw lightly against the hardened aura layer enveloping him, the surface shimmering like crystallized flame. When you learn to do this properly, you will finally have some protection against the cruel laws of the universe. As oddly, the only elements that can interact with the laws are your aura and your soul. Multharic concluded, as he lowered his claw, letting the shield settle smoothly around him before turning his golden gaze toward Leo. The laws? Leo asked, sounding confused, as Multharic chuckled slightly at his words. Yes, the laws. What I'm going to teach you is how to exploit a universal law to your advantage, by bending it just enough to allow you to create a space tunnel where vast distances can be covered by traveling just a few steps. However, bending the law is not easy, and hence the price one needs to pay for it is exceptionally high. Usually, king-level beings can withstand the spatial disturbance caused by space tunneling without much trouble. However, to do the same at the nascent soul stage, you will need to learn a few additional defensive methods that would allow you to battle against the universe's basic forces longer than any mortal should. Multharic explained, as Leo finally felt a bigger picture forming in his mind on what Multharic was trying to achieve here. Chapter 847 Training begins. The time-stilled world, the floating island, Leo's POV. Multharic watched him quietly for a moment, as if measuring whether Leo had truly understood the weight of the lesson, before lifting his claw slightly to signal the beginning of real training. The first step is simple, Multharic instructed, his tone steady as the floating island hummed beneath him. You must unfurl your aura as wide as possible, spread it outward in every direction until it blankets a wide space, since only when it is fully extended can you begin to pull it back, layer by layer, wrapping it around your body until it forms a continuous shield. Multharic guided as Leo inhaled slowly at the instruction, already feeling the difficulty in executing the concept before he even attempted it, yet he nodded nonetheless, before stepping into a wide stance as he allowed his aura to stir within his chest. Womb. His killing intent surged outward in a deep crimson wave as he let it expand across the chamber walls, filling the room with an oppressive heaviness that made the air vibrate faintly. However, the moment he attempted the second step, the problem became obvious. For the moment he tried to pull the aura inward, gathering it around himself in thin layers like Multharic had shown, he felt the first sign of resistance ripple through the crimson haze, as the aura refused to obey his will. Tisk. Leo clicked his tongue while narrowing his eyes, as he attempted again, pushing his will through the killing intent, but the aura only surged in a more chaotic manner, rising in spikes instead of settling into controlled bands, as though it would rather lash outward and tear the world apart than fold itself into anything remotely protective. By the third attempt, his brows had furrowed deeply, the realization settling in like a stone sinking into water. I can unfold the aura freely. I can pull it into myself freely. But folding it around my body is impossible, he thought, as he felt the killing intent recoil the moment he attempted to shape it, the aura twisting against the command with a stubbornness that made his temples pulse from the effort, since it was one thing to dominate, crush, or intimidate, but forcing killing intent to behave like a shield was something that went against its very essence. "This is much harder than I expected," he muttered under his breath, as Multheric let out a soft rumble of amusement, his golden eyes lighting up as he chuckled. "I already warned you, boy, it takes a genius to learn how to perform this move even amongst advanced aura users. Usually kings try to learn this move as a defense against emperors, however, you have potential to learn it at the nascent soul stage based on how far you've already progressed in your aura mastery. However, if it were anyone else but you, I would never dare teach them this move," Multheric said, as Leo bit his lips in understanding. "It will take you a few months to grasp it, boy, but there is no other way to learn this aside from persistence. You must keep at it until something finally clicks, because aura control is not mastered through understanding or talent alone. It is mastered through patience, repetition, and the moment where instinct finally bends to your will," Multheric said, his tone firm yet not harsh, as he provided guidance on what needed to be done. "I see," Leo replied before closing his eyes for a moment as he inhaled deeply, letting the air settle in his lungs while he processed the inevitability of the struggle ahead, knowing full well that the path ahead would be long, painful, and frustrating. Yet when he opened them again, his gaze had steadied once more. "All right," he said quietly, nodding in acceptance as he rolled his shoulders, "if it takes months, it takes months. I'm not leaving until I get it right," he claimed, as Multheric watched him with a faint flicker of approval, the slightest shift of his tail betraying his satisfaction. "Good," the ancient dragon said as he exhaled, "then begin again. From the start," he instructed as Leo nodded without complaint, stepping forward as his aura stirred once more, as he prepared for another attempt at bending his killing intent into something it had never wished to become. Meanwhile after defying Raymond, once again found his freedom stripped away from him, as he was dragged back into chains and locked inside a dark cell deep within the Eternal Garden, where silence pressed against his ears like a living thing while he waited for the execution he knew was coming. At first, he saw the isolation as a curse, since being left alone with nothing but his thoughts gnawed at the edges of his sanity while every hour stretched painfully into the next, as if the cell itself was designed to break his mind long before his body ever touched an execution platform. Yet as the days bled together, something inside him shifted, because once he forced himself to let go of the belief that he could be saved, the crushing weight he carried began to dissolve, as if the moment he stopped expecting rescue, the world outside his cell stopped feeling like a source of torment. At the beginning of his imprisonment he held onto hope with trembling hands, imagining that Leo or someone from the cult would plow through armies or storm the Eternal Garden itself to pull him out of this nightmare. Yet the longer he remained locked away, the more he realized that such hope was too selfish, too desperate, too blind to the reality of what the cult faced. The cult did not need to risk everything for someone like him, and no matter how much he loved Leo as a brother, he did not want the cult jeopardized for the sake of one single life, as the responsibility he carried as a dragon weighed more heavily on him now than it ever had before. If given the choice, he wanted no one to come for him rather than letting anyone from the cult march into danger on his behalf. Since he knew the risks of becoming a dragon, he knew the consequences of remaining on a neutral planet when he chose that path, and he understood the price that came with living under a bloodline that invited both reverence and wrath. Hence, now that his execution drew closer with each hour, Ver found himself strangely calm, as though every regret he once feared had already been confronted and folded into the quiet acceptance of his fate, because beneath the fear and sorrow lay a clarity he had never possessed before, a clarity born from facing death without illusions or denial. In a way, he felt as though he had lived a lifetime inside this short imprisonment, as though the few days he spent locked away had hardened him, refined him, sculpted him into someone who finally understood the weight of responsibility and the fragility of life, his perspective widening into something deeper than he ever imagined possible back when he still walked freely under the open sky. As for the first time, Ver felt truly unafraid. He had no more delusions. No more expectations. No more regrets. Only quiet acceptance, and the faint, distant hope that if the universe allowed Leo to live a long life, then perhaps someday he would avenge this rather meaningless death. Chapter 848 True Fear. Across the wider universe, righteous citizens paw, a few days after Leo's attack on planet Aleon Reach. It took a while for the aftermath of Leo's attacks on planets Omega and Ilion reach to affect the wider universe. However, once the news began to spread, it shook the very fabric of the righteous faction to its core. People trembled as they spoke Leo's name, as they dared not speak it louder than a whisper, as if just speaking his name would summon him out of nowhere, as billions awoke each morning wondering if this day would be the day their world would be reduced to ash. On planet Havran, an old shopkeeper stood behind his stall with trembling hands as he wiped the counter for the 5th time that hour, while the customers around him kept glancing at the sky with haunted eyes, since every distant rumble of thunder made them flinch as if expecting an angry cultist to tear the atmosphere open. "It feels like we are back in the chaos-era times written in history books," the old man muttered as a few others nodded in agreement, their expressions hollow. "I haven't heard my grandfather living in such fear, nor did he hear his grandfather living in such perilous times. These are dark times, I'm telling you. These are some really dark times," he said, as a woman carrying her child close to her chest shivered at his words as she whispered softly while rocking her daughter. The cult were universal terrorists, yes, but they were never this brash, never this relentless, never this bold in striking planet after planet like it was nothing. I haven't heard of so many attacks in such a short span, not in my lifetime, not in my mother's either. Her voice cracked slightly as she lowered her gaze, unable to forget the footage she saw just 2 days earlier, of a fortress world crumbling in hours beneath Leo's wrath as if it were made of sand. "It definitely has to be because they have nothing to lose anymore," another man added grimly while tightening the straps of his travel bag, preparing to flee the planet as soon as his shuttle ticket was confirmed. "That has to be the reason, since no one fights this recklessly unless they have already lost something far worse. And in my understanding the cult has already lost everything that mattered," he said, as he shook his head in disappointment. "I'm rushing over to safer planets. There is a theory on the galaxy net that Skyshard won't target planets with 2 or more monarchs guarding it, or at least that is the hope. So I'm off to such lands. To hell with living costs, life comes first," he said, as across the universe similar conversations brewed in drinking bars, in military dormitories, in cramped shuttle bays, and in crowded hospitals where medics worked overtime after every planetary attack, because the fear was no longer localized to those who had suffered loss, it had seeped into the bones of every civilian living under righteous rule, as if the very notion of safety had become a myth overnight. On planet Aravex, a transport conductor refused to leave the shuttle until he checked the evacuation protocols 3 times, pacing nervously while mumbling under his breath, "One attack, just one, and we are finished. If Skyshard chooses us today then nothing in the universe can stop him, not shields, not fleets, not monarchs. Unless the eternal sovereign saves us himself, nothing else can." A group of soldiers stationed nearby exchanged grim glances, each man gripping their weapons tighter as though the blades offered comfort even though they all knew it was useless against a being like Leo Skyshard, as one of them whispered shakily, "The worst part is not knowing where he will strike next. It's like waiting for a storm you cannot see." Their captain, a seasoned veteran decorated for surviving 4 wars, stood silently with his jaw clenched, acknowledging that even he had never felt such helplessness, since war at least offered direction, purpose, strategy, whereas this new terror felt like the universe had become a roulette wheel and every planet's name sat carved on one of its spinning slots. On planet Verlia, a school teacher paused mid-lesson as the building shook from a distant tremor, her heart stuttering as she pulled the children close, while the parents waiting outside stared up at the sky with wide eyes because even harmless natural quakes now felt like omens of incoming doom. "I heard planet Omega fell in 10 hours, a father whispered to his wife, his voice cracking as he spoke. "I heard Skyshard was so furious he burned their entire command base down to its atoms. How do you even fight a creature like that? How do you even breathe knowing he can appear anywhere?" Stories like this passed from mouth to mouth until rumor became belief and belief became dread, because no matter how exaggerated some tales were, the reality behind them was terrifying enough on its own, as everyone knew at least one official report confirming that entire planets had vanished under Leo's attacks. Across the entire righteous territory a single shared truth echoed through every heart, whispered in fear, muttered in anger, spoken in despair. It could be our planet next. It could be our home. It could be today. As the fear of Leo Skyshard of the cult settled over the universe like a suffocating blanket, pressing into every home and every heart while The stars themselves felt hostile, as though the sky could split open at any moment and doom might pour through in the shape of a lone warrior, causing the citizens of the righteous faction to live each day with their breaths held tight in their chests, wondering if the next distant tremor, the next flicker of light in the sky, or the next ripple of cosmic energy would mark the moment their world finally came to an end. Chapter 849, A God Training. Meanwhile, the Eternal Garden, Raymond's POV. Raymond wandered casually through the Eternal Garden, his mind drifting in quiet thought as he followed the winding paths, when a sharp whistling sound sliced through the tranquility of the realm. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. The sound was far too crisp and far too lethal to belong in a place reserved for eternal stillness, as each repeating rush of air resembled high-speed blade strikes cutting through space. Blade strikes, and here. He wondered, his brows knitting in confusion as he turned toward the source of the noise, his steps quickening as the whistling grew louder, until he reached the far corner of the sacred domain where the garden's crystal tiles trembled faintly under a pressure he could not immediately comprehend. There, illuminated beneath the soft radiance of the floating sky lanterns, stood Caliph, his body drenched in sweat as it streamed down the sides of his face, his usually immaculate appearance undone completely while his lips tightened in effort, as his arm repeated the same stabbing motion with a simple dagger clutched in his grip. Are my eyes betraying me, or is father actually training? He wondered, as he felt a jolt of disbelief tear through him. Before today, not once in his entire life had he ever witnessed Caliph practice combat, nor had he ever seen him sweat. However, the true shock did not come from the sight of Caliph moving a dagger, but rather from what Raymond naturally perceived beneath it, because as a demigod whose senses had already stepped into the fourth dimension, he could not help but see the real technique hidden behind those deceptively simple motions. To a mortal, Caliph looked like a tired man thrusting a blade. His jabs no different from a simple stab. However, to Raymond, each jab detonated into a terrifying bloom of temporal distortion, as the dagger's path fractured into countless spectral afterimages that stretched across past, present, and immediate future, creating layered silhouettes of Caliph's arm in dozens of micro-timelines overlapping the real one with absolute synchronicity. What the fuck even is that move? He wondered, as he saw every thrust piercing the temporal membrane as though stabbing into a sheet of vibrating glass, causing thin silver cracks to flash around the blade before sealing instantly, while faint echoes of yesterday's light and tomorrow's shadow rippled across the garden floor in a disorienting cascade of temporal noise. Gasp! Raymond's breath tightened because the strikes before him did not simply move fast, but rather moved in multiple time states at once, as if Caliph's body existed in more than one frame of reality during each attack, the dagger splitting into a constellation of overlapping trajectories that converged at the exact same spatial point with flawless precision. These are time-piercing slashes, direct violations of continuity, he thought, feeling an involuntary shiver race down his spine, because this was not training meant to hone strength or speed, this was training meant to reawaken a divine instinct that had been dormant for a couple thousand years. Caliph's movements were not grand. They were not dramatic. They were not theatrical. They were perfectly aligned with the rhythm of existence, each strike landing on the thinnest point of the temporal flow, slipping through weaknesses only gods or half-gods could perceive, as though Caliph had memorized the microscopic pulses of time and was now carving straight through it with clinical brutality. If father is truly training for a fight after all these years, then it can only mean one thing: he is genuinely afraid of facing uncle. There is no other explanation for it, because father would never dirty his hands with drills unless the opponent demanded nothing less than perfection. He is sharpening himself again because of uncle. Raymond concluded as he bit the bottom of his lip, his thoughts swirling in an uncontrollable haze, as he found himself torn between admiration and helplessness, unable to stop marveling at his father's terrifying mastery while also wondering, with a quiet ache in his chest, whether he would ever reach such heights himself or whether the gap between them would forever remain a chasm he could only stare across from a distance. It's rude to stare at another man while he's training. Did your father never teach you such basic etiquette? Caliph asked mid-drill, his voice deep and powerful, as Raymond instantly lowered his head in shame. He did. I'm sorry, father, Raymond said, as Caliph completed the last portion of his drill, before turning to meet his eye. Yes, I did, which is why you must never repeat this offense again. Next time if you hear training sounds coming from this portion of the garden, go the other way. Caliph warned, as Raymond sheepishly nodded in understanding. "If I may, father." Raymond asked, his voice quiet as he kept his head low, unsure whether he was even allowed to speak at this moment. As Caliph tilted his head slightly, the dagger still held loosely in his grip as thin wisps of killing intent rose around it. "Speak," he said, his tone neither warm nor cold, simply absolute, as Raymond swallowed once, gathering the courage he needed, because the question perched on his tongue felt dangerous, yet necessary. "Are you training because you're nervous about facing Uncle Soren?" he asked. As the moment the name left his lips the entire garden seemed to fall still, as though time itself paused to listen, while Caliph slowly lowered the dagger to his side. "Nervous." He repeated the word calmly, almost tasting it before dismissing it altogether. "No." Caliph's gaze sharpened with a clarity that cut through the air like a blade, his sweat-soaked hair clinging to his forehead as he stood tall, straightening his spine with quiet resolve. "I am training because I must be at my best when I face my brother," he said, his voice steady, unshaken, carrying no trace of pride or false humility. "For anything less, and I will be dead," he claimed, as Raymond's eyes widened in disbelief, his breath catching in his throat as he lifted his head without meaning to, because not once in his life had he heard his father speak with such directness, such certainty, such stark honesty. There was no sarcasm in Caliph's voice. No jest. No exaggeration. Just a simple statement of reality, delivered as casually as recounting the weather. He spoke of Soren not as an enemy, not as a rival, but as a force of nature. A calamity. A truth of the universe. As he knew very well that Soren was not someone who could not be challenged lightly without paying the price in blood. Just how strong is Uncle? Raymond wondered, for if Caliph, the eternal sovereign, one of the most feared beings in all creation, needed to sharpen himself to perfection just to survive a confrontation with Soren, then what exactly was Soren? And what was about to happen when these two brothers finally met? After 2,000 years, Raymond felt the weight of that future pressing against his chest as Caliph turned away, raising his dagger once more, as he prepared to continue the terrifying time-piercing drills as if the conversation had never happened. "Do not mistake my honesty for fear," Caliph added quietly, stabbing forward as another temporal fracture split open around the blade. "I am not scared of my brother. I simply respect the fact that he can kill me," he said, as the words echoed through the eternal garden like a prophecy, while Raymond stood frozen in place, realizing for the first time in his life that even gods had someone they feared losing to. Chapter 850. A Fallen Titan. Meanwhile, Planet Ixtal, the old stone castle, Soren's POV. Soren stood alone in the outer training quarters of the old stone castle as he quietly debated whether he should even attempt to train at all, the question lingering heavily in his mind while the cold air pressed against his decaying skin. "Ha!" A long sigh slipped from his throat as he chuckled softly, studying the miserable state his once mighty body had been reduced to, his breath shaking as he acknowledged what he had tried so long to ignore. His skin now hung loosely from his bones, sagging weakly with every movement, while streaks of thick black goo seeped slowly from the countless wounds carved long ago by the cursed origin dagger, as at this stage there existed not a single joint in his body that did not pulse with relentless aching pain, each throb reminding him just how far he had fallen from the warrior he used to be. "I really do not wish to move any more than I am absolutely required to. However, Father always said that for a fighter to remain at his sharpest, he must train every single day." Soren murmured quietly as he lowered his gaze, bending down with great difficulty to pick up a wooden dagger lying near his feet, its feather-light weight settling surprisingly well into his weak palms as his fingers curled around the hilt with familiarity he thought he had lost, his tired eyes sharpening immediately the moment a weapon found its place within his grasp. "Inhale." He inhaled slowly, letting the cold air fill his hollow chest as he raised the dagger beside his ribs, then exhaled while thrusting forward in a simple jab meant to serve as the foundation for every time-piercing technique he had ever mastered. Took. The tip of the wooden blade cut forward with a muted sound, yet Soren felt his entire elbow spike with sharp pain as if a nail had been hammered straight into the joint, his knees wobbling slightly as he gritted his teeth while the familiar temporal feedback failed to manifest around him. Too slow, he thought quietly, lowering the dagger as disappointment pooled in his chest, because despite attempting the most basic motion, he felt the air shift out of rhythm, slipping through the cracks in his weakened aura rather than bending around him with the obedience it once displayed. My base state has no strength anymore, it's only when I tap into divine essence that my pain and fatigue disappears and I can maintain my god-level strength. However, without it, Soren muttered as he tried again. Took. The second jab landed slightly cleaner, yet the moment the strike extended fully, a rush of black ooze spilled from the torn scars across his shoulder as the cursed residue sizzled faintly against his skin, while his vision swayed for a moment under the strain of maintaining the stance. Thud. Soren steadied himself by planting his foot more firmly on the cracked stone, his breath coming heavier now as he forced his muscles to listen, because every fiber of his body felt stiff. Unresponsive, as if he were trying to command a corpse rather than a living form. No. Again, he thought, as he raised the dagger again. Took, took, took. Each repetition grew weaker as his arms trembled violently, yet Soren refused to stop, for he knew that the true essence of the drill did not lie in speed or force, but in perfect alignment with the thinning points of the temporal membrane, something he could once sense instinctively but now struggled to feel through the haze of pain clouding his senses. Pant, pant. His breath hitched as he paused between jabs, sweat mixing with the black ooze running down his torso, while fatigue pulled heavily at his limbs, dragging him toward the ground like invisible chains. Pathetic, Soren muttered under his breath as he shook his head slightly, unable to believe how far he had fallen, since there had been a time when entire armies froze upon witnessing his time-slashing drills, a time when he carved through enemy demigods as though they were made of fragile porcelain, a time when even his father himself stepped lightly around him during sparring. Yet now, he could barely lift a wooden dagger without his body trembling. Should I have had my last stand a long time ago? He wondered, as he took another breath, deeper this time, letting it settle into his chest as he repeated the motion with renewed focus, determined not to let the decay of his flesh dictate the state of his will. Swoosh. A small ripple finally appeared, barely more than a distortion in the corner of his vision, yet it was enough to make his heart tighten with faint hope, for it felt like the temporal membrane had acknowledged him, even if only for a moment. However, the price of even that minor success was instant. His knees buckled as pain flared across every wound where the origin dagger's curse had seeped deeply, the blackened veins pulsing violently under his skin as if trying to tear themselves apart, forcing Soren to drop to one knee as the dagger clattered weakly against the floor beside him. His breathing turned ragged as his fingers dug into the stone for support, while his thoughts tried to remain clear despite the dizzying ache flooding his mind. This body, it really is nearing its limit, he admitted silently as he lifted his trembling hand toward the fallen dagger, determined to continue despite the agony weighing him down like molten iron. He managed to pick it up again, though his grip barely held firm, as the wooden handle slipped slightly between his weakened fingers, yet even so, his eyes sharpened once more with the stubborn resolve that had carried him through the bloodiest wars in the universe. Because despite everything he had lost, despite the rot consuming him from within, despite knowing he was a faint shadow of the warrior he once was, he refused to let his final days pass in helpless decline. Again, he muttered, as he raised the dagger again. Swoosh. The jab shook violently, tearing another streak of black fluid from his ribs, yet Soren did not flinch, for he was not training to defeat Caliph, nor training to stand victorious in some future battle. He was training so that when the time came for him to confront the truth of what awaited him, he would face it standing rather than crawling, fighting rather than surrendering, unbroken rather than forgotten. If I cannot return to my prime, Soren whispered softly, lifting the blade once more, then at the very least, I will not meet the end as a coward. He resolved, as although his next strike was weaker, his next breath strained, behind every motion lingered a will powerful enough to shake the universe, a will that refused to die even when the body carrying it had already begun to fade. As training under that will, Soren felt something quiet settle inside his heart, something almost peaceful. As for the first time in many millennia, he felt like himself again. Chapter 851 Aura Shield Mastered. Meanwhile, within the time-stilled world, Multhorak's floating island, Leo's POV. Although only a couple days had passed in the outside universe, a couple hundred days had passed for Leo within the time-stilled world, As his aura shield training progressed by leaps and bounds, the once impossible concept now slowly beginning to bend to his will as repetition carved understanding deeper into his bones. What had once seemed like an unsolvable puzzle to him, now became something he could finally grasp, maybe not flawlessly yet, but enough for him to feel the shield taking shape around him in a way that resembled what Multharic had demonstrated so long ago. He had spent the past 200 days dissolving every misconception he held about his own aura, peeling away instinctual habits that valued aggression over control, while forcing himself again and again to smooth the roughness in his killing intent until it obeyed him rather than resisting every command like a feral beast unwilling to be tamed. "All right, let's do this once more," he whispered to himself as he widened his stance, raising his hands slightly before allowing the aura inside him to unfold. Womb. A deep crimson fog expanded outward from his body as the air thickened instantly, spreading across the chamber like a living storm, the killing intent rolling out in wide arcs until it touched every wall, pressing lightly against the stone as if testing its limits. Shake. Leo watched the crimson haze ripple, then exhaled as he began the second part of the process, which was to force the aura to retreat, as he pulled it back inward, strand by strand, tightening it carefully with a precision that had taken him months to acquire. The crimson fog thinned as it coiled around him, while faint cracks of resistance flickered within the flow, yet this time Leo pushed through them, letting instinct guide him where brute strength could not, as the aura folded around his shoulders first, then wrapped down across his ribs, then gathered at his legs, forming soft overlapping layers like a thick blanket being tucked into place. BZZZZT. The shield solidified with a muffled hum, settling tightly around his skin as if it had always belonged there. As from his position near the edge of the chamber, Multharic watched with narrowed eyes, his gaze heavy with quiet approval as he observed every step with unblinking focus. "The boy definitely has extremely high comprehension," Multharic noted, his ancient thoughts nearly impressed despite centuries of restraint. "He has mastered in a few months what takes most warriors years. His control has evolved far beyond what I anticipated." Leo finished the final compression, letting the aura lock around him with a subtle pulse as he straightened his back, waiting for Multharac's usual critique, expecting a correction or a lecture about finesse or density or stability. However, instead of scolding, Multharic slowly lifted his head in approval. "That looks good enough," the old dragon said, as Leo blinked in confusion as the dragon's soul body began to brighten. "Ah, old dragon, what are you?" he began, however, Multharic did not answer. Womb. Multharac's aura erupted all at once, unfolding like a cataclysm of ancient force as the entire chamber was drowned in a suffocating red mist, the pressure slamming into Leo like a falling mountain as the floating island trembled from its core to its edges. Boom. Crack. The stone beneath Leo's feet split slightly as he gasped, instinct forcing him down onto one knee while the crushing divine pressure pushed against the aura shield from every direction, testing every layer Leo had spent months learning to form. "The fuck?" he wondered, as his vision blurred for a moment, his breath hitched, and his skull throbbed as if a hammer struck behind his eyes. But despite all these problems, he somehow still remained conscious, could still breathe, and was still lucid. Grind. Leo grit his teeth hard as the shield around him pulsed violently, absorbing the brunt of the dragon's force even as cracks of pain shot through his muscles. "What? Are you crazy, old dragon? Have you completely lost your marbles?" Leo shouted, his voice strained yet unmistakably alive despite the crushing weight threatening to flatten him into the ground. As Multharic grinned ear to ear listening to his words. "Boy, if you can survive my pressure, then you can survive any pressure," Multharic replied as he slowly withdrew the oppressive aura, allowing the chamber to return to its natural calm. "You did not falter. You did not lose consciousness. You did not crumble. That is enough proof that your aura shield is as strong as it needs to be," Multharic said as he folded his tail behind his back as the last of his divine aura settled around him like faint embers. "You have successfully completed the first phase of your training," he declared, as Leo remained on one knee for a moment, panting softly as the weight lifted off his bones, before finally letting out a shaky slew of curses. "Fucking old monsters, I swear they all have a few marbles loose." I can already envision it. If Multharic wrote a meditation manual, it would be no less irritating than those written by the timeless assassin and family. Leo cursed, before standing up, as Multharic made a long face. Towards him. Boy, usually when a student completes a difficult phase of training, they thank their teacher for it. I do not expect you to kowtow to me in respect. However, a little appreciation would go a long way, Multheric said, as Leo felt his left eye flicker at the dragon's demands. A little warning about these kinds of stunts that can potentially snuff out my life will also go a long way, he countered, as Multheric burst into laughter at his antics. Never in his life had he ever met a kid as brash and talented as Leo, as usually, the young dragons he did guide in his youth were usually extremely respectful of him since he was the Dragon King, which made this dynamic he had with Leo now completely unique and refreshing. Alright then, that's fair. You can thank me after we complete the second phase of your training, he began, as he prepared for the demonstration of the next phase. Chapter 852 The concept behind space tunneling. You have done well with your aura shield, boy, so now we begin the part that actually matters for space tunneling, Multheric said, as he settled his massive soul form into a more relaxed posture, the chamber quieting around them as if the floating island itself understood that something far more complex was about to be discussed. First, I want you to imagine a long corridor in front of you filled with walls, hundreds, thousands of them, each one thick, hard, and seemingly unbreakable at first glance. Multheric continued, his golden eyes narrowing slightly as he painted the picture with his words. These walls are full of structural weaknesses, hairline cracks and soft spots that cannot be seen easily. However, if you strike one of those exact points with even a minimal amount of strength, there is a chance the entire wall collapses, while if you run blindly into it headfirst you may break your skull, fall on your back, and still fail to break the wall itself, he said, as Leo folded his arms and listened, his mind already trying to follow the metaphor as he pictured wall after wall stretching endlessly into the distance. So the name of the game is simple, Multheric explained, his voice calm as his tail drew a slow line across the floor. You must learn to hit the wall at its weakest point, the one flaw that allows everything else to give way, because if you can do that again and again, wall after wall, then eventually you will move through that corridor with almost no resistance, Multheric added, as Leo nodded slowly in understanding. Alright, so wall after wall, strike the weak points, move forward effortlessly, that is the concept, Leo asked, as Multheric inclined his head. Yes, because when I speak of walls here, I am being metaphorical, Multheric clarified, his eyes gleaming faintly. The corridor is the path through the fourth dimension, the walls are the temporal membranes you must pierce, and the weak points are the thin spots in time-space where the structure is at its most fragile, where a precise push allows you to slip through instead of crashing uselessly against it, he said, as Leo's brows furrowed slightly, the idea slowly beginning to take shape in his head. So space tunneling is basically traveling through the fourth dimension by slipping through these weak points, while to someone trapped in three-dimensional thinking it would look like I covered an impossible distance in just a few steps, Leo asked, as he tried to put the concept into his own words. Exactly, Multheric replied, giving the faintest nod of approval. To anyone bound strictly to the third dimension, 2 points in space can seem impossibly far apart, millions of kilometers away. However, when you learn to thread through the fourth dimension between those 2 points, you realize that from that higher perspective they sit almost side by side, separated by only a few thin walls instead of a vast gulf, Multheric said, letting the analogy settle, as he stared at Leo for a few seconds, making sure he understood. That is what space tunneling truly is, traveling not across the surface of the universe, but through its depth in time-space, slipping through weak segments of the temporal structure until you emerge somewhere that should have been unreachable in such a short span, he finished, as Leo let out a slow breath. Sounds simple when you say it like that, Leo muttered wryly, as Multheric allowed himself a small smirk. If it were truly simple, the universe would be full of travelers bending reality in their favor, but you know that is not the case, Multheric said, his gaze turning more serious as he shifted the conversation. Now we arrive at the real problem. Normally, beings who perform this technique properly are king-level warriors and above, because at their stage they can already perceive the fourth dimension directly, at least to a limited degree, which allows them to see the thin points for what they are, Multheric explained, as his tail tapped once against the stone. However, you, even as you are now, cannot see the fourth dimension at all, not even as a flicker at the edge of your senses, which makes it much harder for you to do the same. Multheric said, as Leo nodded quietly, accepting this limitation. So if I cannot see the weak points, how am I supposed to hit them? Leo asked, frowning slightly. By using the only part of you that already stretches into the fourth dimension. Multheric replied, his gaze sharpening. Your aura. Leo blinked as he processed those words. My aura, he repeated, as Multheric gestured lightly with one claw. Yes, while everything around you that you can see, hear, touch, and interact with directly exists within 3 dimensions, your aura is not limited in the same way, since it does not stop at the visible boundary of the room when you unfurl it, but rather stretches past the surface of what you can perceive, bleeding into the 4th dimension even. Though your eyes cannot follow it there. Multheric said, with a hint of pride that came from centuries of understanding. When you spread your killing intent through this chamber, you only see the part that fills the visible air, but there is an entire section of that aura extending beyond the veil, threading through fractures and currents in time-space, brushing against places you do not yet have the language to describe. He continued, as Leo's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. So even if my consciousness cannot see the 4th dimension, my aura is already swimming in it. Leo asked, as Multheric smiled faintly. Precisely, which is why we will not try to teach your eyes to see what they are not yet ready for. Instead we will teach your aura to feel what you cannot look at directly, and then teach you to interpret those sensations with your current mind. Multheric said, his tone turning instructional. Think of your aura as your hand reaching through a curtain into another room, while your eyes remain on this side of the cloth, unable to see what lies beyond, but your fingers can still feel the walls, the furniture, the objects, even though your sight is blind to them. He guided, as Leo slowly nodded while following the comparison. So what you must do is unfurl your aura not merely to suppress or intimidate, but to explore, to trace the shape of the unseen fabric around you, to find where the 4th dimensional structure feels thin, frayed, weaker than the rest. Multheric said, his voice dropping slightly. Those are your cracks in the wall, the spots where space-time is fragile enough to be pierced, those are the weak points you must stab through in order to tunnel. He added, as Leo inhaled deeply. How am I supposed to feel that though? Leo asked, the question genuine rather than stubborn. To me, aura has always felt like pressure and weight and lethality, not like some kind of sensory organ. He admitted, as Multheric let out a low chuckle. That is because up until now you have only used it as a weapon. Never as an eye. Multheric answered. You have focused on how much weight it can impose, how much fear it can draw, how much suppression it can exert. However, you have never trained yourself to feel what your aura feels in return, when it touches the world around it. He said, as Leo blinked, realizing he had never considered it from that direction. When you unfurl your aura, you always think about how others experience it, Multheric continued. You think about how it crushes their lungs, how it bends their knees, how it chokes their will. However, from now on, you must reverse the equation and ask yourself a different question every time you unfold it. Multheric said, his gaze piercing. How do different parts of the room feel to your killing intent? He asked quietly. Where does your aura flow smoothly? Where does it thicken? Where does it shudder as if pressing against something stubborn? Where does it suddenly slip through as if nothing is there at all? Every minor change becomes a data point, because your aura is already brushing against temporal currents that your eyes cannot see. Multheric clarified, as Leo's brows drew together in concentration. So I spread it out, pay attention not to what it does to others, but to what it experiences itself, then I look for places where it feels thinner resistance, like dips in the fabric. Leo summarized, as Multheric nodded. Yes, those dips are the early hints of temporal weaknesses, like hollows in an otherwise solid wall, and while your current senses are nowhere near fine enough to map them clearly, with repetition and focus you will begin to recognize the difference between pushing your aura against a reinforced segment of time-space and slipping it through a crack where the structure is weak. Multheric said, as Leo exhaled slowly. So this is what you meant when you said aura control is everything, Leo muttered, as Multheric gave a faint smile. Control, sensitivity, patience, Multheric corrected. Without these, you will never locate enough of those weak points in sequence to form a proper tunnel, instead you will simply slam your aura randomly into time-space and tear yourself apart in the process. He warned, his tone suddenly very serious. However, if you can teach your aura to map this chamber in 4 dimensions, then when the time comes you will be able to stand in the void between worlds, extend your killing intent, and feel exactly where to push in order to move from one impossible point to another. Multharic said, as Leo's eyes hardened with resolve. All right, Leo replied, rolling his shoulders slowly as he prepared himself for the next phase. Chapter 853 An Unexpected Death. Within the time-stilled world, Multharac's floating island, Leo's POV. Leo stood in the center of the chamber with his palms slightly open and his aura uncoiled around him, its faint crimson haze drifting through the air as Multharic circled him slowly, the dragon kindly guiding him through his first practical attempt at sensing the 4th dimension. Spread your aura wider, boy, not to crush or intimidate, but to feel, Multharic instructed softly as his voice rumbled with ancient patience. Search for places where your killing intent passes smoothly, then search for places where it slows as if pushing against something stubborn, then search again for places where it slips through with almost no resistance. These minute differences are the beginnings of what you must learn. Leo inhaled, nodding as he pushed his aura outward until it filled the chamber entirely, each breath steady as he tried to shift his focus away from how the aura behaved and towards what the aura experienced, following Multharac's earlier teachings with full concentration. Good, now listen closely to your killing intent, Multharic continued as he tapped the floor with the tip of his dragon claw. You are not trying to sense walls directly, you are trying to sense how your aura reacts to the invisible terrain around it. Let the aura become your fingers, let the air become the curtain, let the pressure or lack of pressure guide your understanding. Leo closed his eyes, knitting his brows tightly as he spread his aura again, focusing intensely on the faintest changes in sensation, waiting for anything at all that felt like a dip or a hollow or a thin patch in the fabric of the world. Seconds passed, then minutes. Nothing. His aura felt exactly the same everywhere. Just pressure. Just weight. Just him. He tried again, pushing the aura out in a smoother wave, then pulling it back in, then extending it sharply to see if the sudden motion would help him feel a shift in the unseen structure around him. But unfortunately, he still felt nothing. There was no slip. There was no catch. There was no thinness. There was no distortion. Just the same heavy haze pressing outward, filling the same chamber, meeting the same air, reacting the same way no matter what angle or intensity Leo used. Old dragon. I do not feel anything, Leo muttered, frustration creeping into his tone. Of course, you will not feel it immediately, Multharic replied as he floated to Leo's left. Try again, but this time stretch your focus thinner. Your aura is too coarse. Soften it until it feels like silk rather than a blade. Leo exhaled and softened the aura, letting it unwind gently like a slow exhale of mist. He waited. Still nothing. He tried expanding it faster, then slower, then in spirals, then in layered pulses similar to the aura shield training. Nothing. Everything felt flat, uniform, empty. Not even a flicker of change. Leo clenched his fists as irritation simmered beneath his skin. Are you sure I'm not doing something wrong? You are doing everything correctly, Multharic assured him. However, doing something correctly does not guarantee progress when your senses have never reached into this realm before. Try again, he encouraged, as Leo tried again. Then again. Then again. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as he repeated the same motions with absolute focus, each attempt hitting the same blank wall of sensation, each extension of aura returning the same dull feedback. He paced. He stood still. He focused deeply. He cleared his mind. But unfortunately for him, nothing helped, for in the end, he still sensed nothing. As finally, after what felt like far too many cycles of pointless attempts, Leo dropped his arms with a defeated sigh. Old dragon, I genuinely think I'm poking the air like an idiot, he said, as Multharic watched him for a moment, his ancient eyes sweeping slowly over Leo's tired expression, before the dragon finally let out a deep, heavy exhale of his own. Yeah, Multharic said quietly as he rubbed his forehead with one massive claw, this is going to take a while for you to grasp, at least a couple years, he said, as Leo mentally prepared himself for a couple years of mentally draining training. Meanwhile, Chaosbringer's POV. Chaosbringer sat behind his polished wooden desk, his fingers lightly Tapping against the armrest as he reviewed the pending reports for the day, his expression serene in a way that suggested nothing in the universe could disturb his composure, when the doors to his office suddenly slammed open. Bam! Seventh Elder. Seventh Elder. A young assistant rushed in breathlessly, her face pale with panic as she clutched a data slate to her chest, the urgency in her footsteps echoing sharply across the chamber. Chaosbringer lifted his gaze slowly, meeting her frantic eyes with a calm so deep it seemed almost rehearsed, as though he had already prepared himself for whatever disaster she believed she was bringing. "I have some horrible news," she began, her voice trembling slightly as she tried to steady her breathing. Chaosbringer merely raised a brow, his mind already far ahead of her. For he knew precisely which topic she had come to deliver, as he had already rehearsed this performance long before she ever entered the room. "The fourth elder, he passed away yesterday night in his sleep," she stammered as her hands tightened further around the data slate, "and the doctors have officially declared him dead this morning," she informed, as Chaosbringer let out a long, controlled exhale as he leaned away from the table, an expression of gentle sympathy spreading across his face with flawless precision, one he had practiced many times over the years whenever the situation demanded that he appear humane. "Any foul play detected?" he asked softly as he folded his hands on the desk, his tone perfectly measured, carrying the right balance of concern and authority, as the assistant shook her head quickly. "None whatsoever. The initial reports claim heart failure. The internal investigators also found nothing suspicious," she replied as Chaosbringer nodded slowly, his expression turning solemn. "I see, it is truly unfortunate then," he murmured as he closed his eyes briefly, as though honoring the memory of the fallen elder. "He was a good man, beloved by many, a pillar of our elders' council. I'm sure his absence will be felt deeply," he said, as the assistant bowed her head, her voice dropping. "They are planning to hold a public funeral tomorrow. There are predictions that thousands will attend, perhaps even tens of thousands, considering how respected he was," she shared, as Chaosbringer opened his eyes again, offering a soft, mournful smile. "Then of course I will attend as well," he said gently as he rose to his feet, adjusting the cuffs of his robe with deliberate grace. "Inform the security team of my intentions. I will pay my final respects as any loyal brother of the cult should," he said, as the assistant nodded in understanding. "Yes, Seventh Elder. I will notify them immediately," she said before bowing hurriedly, as she rushed towards the door, unaware of the truth that lingered behind Chaosbringer's carefully crafted mask. Click. The doors shut softly behind her, silence filling the room once again. As only then did Chaosbringer's expression finally shift. His smile flattened into a thin, cold line, devoid of grief, devoid of guilt, devoid of even the faintest tremor of remorse, as he tapped his polished nails once against the desk. Click. The fourth elder, he whispered under his breath, should have chosen his alliances more wisely. A faint glint of satisfaction passed through his eyes, the kind only a man who had orchestrated the very death being mourned could possess. For while the assistant hurried through the corridors preparing funeral arrangements, she remained blissfully unaware that it was Chaosbringer's own order, signed in quiet secrecy and executed by shadows that owed him their lives, which had ensured the fourth elder would never wake again. And tomorrow, beneath the grieving crowd, beneath the tears and prayers and ceremonial rites, Chaosbringer planned to stand among them all with that same serene expression, honoring a death he himself had written into existence. Chapter 854 Invitations. Meanwhile, across the universe, Morris did not want Vare's execution to be a mundane affair, and hence, apart from making the livestream accessible across the universe, he also planned to gather some of the most influential figures in existence as witnesses to this so-called historic purge, for which, he instructed the universal government administrators to issue formal invitations on his behalf. He invited everyone, from notable civilian sector figures such as famous traders, adventurers, bankers, blacksmiths, and renowned craftsmen, to the branch clan leaders of the great clans, along with their budding young talents who were eager to be seen at such a politically charged event. However, separate from the civilian invitations, a much heavier summons was dispatched to hundreds of righteous faction commanders, whereby they were not merely invited but ordered to attend the execution and to bring with them no fewer than a couple million of their most elite soldiers each, turning the event into a grand demonstration of unity and power under the universal government's banner. By the time all invitations were dispatched, the expected attendance had risen to a staggering 2.5 billion individuals. To Honorable Merchant Union Leader, Vegapunk. This is to inform you that, by decree of the universal government, the public execution of evil cult Messiah Aegon Ver, widely recognized as the greatest evil of the modern era and the central pillar of the cult's destructive influence, has been formally scheduled. You are hereby cordially invited to attend this historic event. For generations, the cult has undermined the progress of civilized worlds, destabilized trade routes, incited rebellion across peaceful sectors, and unleashed untold suffering upon innocent lives. However, with the capture of Aegon Ver, the shadow that has long loomed over the righteous domains is finally nearing its end. The ceremony marks the dawn of a new age for the universe, an age defined by restored order, reinforced unity, and the final extinguishing of a threat that has haunted countless star systems. And as a respected leader within the Merchant Union, your presence is requested so that you may stand witness to the closing of this dark chapter and the beginning of a more stable future for all interstellar commerce. The execution will take place within the holy grounds of the Pit, at the Celestial Judgment Platform, with attendance strictly limited to distinguished figures whose influence and service to the universe merit recognition. You may arrive with a maximum of 2 personal guards. We look forward to your valued presence at this momentous turning point in universal history. Thousands of such letters were sent across the stars to distinguished guests, with not a single recipient daring to decline an invitation issued directly by the universal government. We must go. That was the first reaction spoken aloud by countless merchants, traders, guild leaders, and adventurers across the stars as they held the pale gold invitation in trembling hands, the weight of its seal settling onto their shoulders like a decree from heaven. This might be our only chance to ever see the true gods in person. This might be a once-in-a-millennia chance that cannot be squandered. They whispered to themselves, their hearts racing at the rumors now sweeping through marketplaces and starports, rumors claiming that this execution would not be a simple public spectacle but a convergence of powers so great that the very sky above the pit might tremble beneath their collective presence. No one truly knew whether the gods would attend or not. Yet the mere possibility was enough to ignite a feverish excitement in every corner of the universe where the letter arrived, as traders began packing their finest robes and adventurers checked their weapon seals twice over, while noble youths saw this as their greatest opportunity to appear before the leaders of creation and carve their names into future political alliances. We cannot miss this, some said while rushing to prepare their vessels. This is history. This is destiny. This is the moment the universe changes forever. Even the most self-preserving individuals found themselves tempted, for invitations of this caliber were treasures in themselves, and attendance brought with it a silent promise of recognition, influence, and future access to circles no commoner could normally dream of reaching. Meanwhile, in military command hubs scattered across righteous space, the reactions were far less enthusiastic. Commanders stared down at the summons delivered to them by their adjutants, their brows tightening as they read the lines instructing them to gather a couple million elite soldiers each and depart immediately for the pit, arriving days ahead of the ceremony for security formation and coordinated positioning. Some commanders exchanged uneasy glances with their officers, for all of them were painfully aware of the one problem no civilian invitation mentioned: Leo Skyshard, the demon of Omega, the butcher of Aeon Reach. The unpredictable force who had, in the past weeks, raised entire planets without warning, and who showed no discernible pattern in selecting his victims. Leaving our sectors undefended at a time like this feels like suicide, one commander muttered under his breath as he rolled the letter between his fingers, his jaw tightening at the thought of abandoning his people. What if Skyshard strikes while we are away? What if he sees this as an opportunity? Another whispered as he paced across the war room, unable to suppress the cold dread pooling in his gut. But dread did not change the truth written at the bottom of the letter. This was not a request. It was an order carrying the full weight of the universal government. Failure to comply meant treason. And treason meant execution. All commanders understood this, and so, despite their reservations, despite their fear for the planets they would leave behind, despite the rising tension shaking the righteous faction as Skyshard's attacks escalated beyond reason, they began preparing their forces for travel. Mobilize the First and Second Fleets, prepare departure protocols, and leave planetary defense to the Legion commanders. We have no choice. This decree was not written for debate. They said, one after another, their voices hardening with resignation as their officers scrambled to obey. Even the bravest among them felt a knot in their stomach, for the idea of gathering the universe's best forces in one place, while the rest of the universe stood on the brink of chaos felt like a gamble the universal government should not have taken, yet still took without hesitation. But no matter how each commander felt, no matter how heavy the order weighed upon their hearts, all of them ultimately arrived at the same bleak conclusion. This is an order from the universal government. We will attend. And so preparations began across the righteous faction, fleets were assembled, soldiers were selected, and travel routes were finalized, as billions prepared to converge upon the pit, unaware that the greatest storm in universal history was quietly gathering beyond their sight. Chapter 855 The Gathering. 17 days before Vare's scheduled execution, the pit. As instructed by Morris, the righteous faction forces gathered on the pit 17 days before Vare's execution, as fleet after fleet arrived in steady succession while the landing zones filled with disciplined formations stretching across the barren plains. Step, step, step. Each army division marched out with an air of practiced confidence, as elite soldiers who had seen countless campaigns carried themselves like veterans who no longer needed to proclaim their worth, while subtle glances exchanged between rival units revealed the familiar spark of internal competition. The pit became a meeting ground for some of the most accomplished fighters in the universe, as everyone present seemed eager to prove their banner stood higher than the rest, maybe hoping that their presence here would later be recorded as part of a historic moment. As even within the same organization, pride simmered beneath the surface, as officers walked with slightly raised shoulders while comparing ranks in passing, and younger soldiers whispered about which division carried the stronger legends into this gathering. Yeah, Commander Dewey is a good fighter. I heard he once killed an ancient swamp frog on his own. However, Commander Potter is in a league of his own. I once saw him suppressing 2 transcendent tier opponents with a single attack. I can't describe how it looked, but it gave me goosebumps. I'm so glad I fight for Commander Potter. Oh please, everyone knows Commander Potter accredits Commander Dumbledore to be his teacher. Commander Dumbledore has been suppressing the cult before Commander Potter was ever born. He is clearly the strongest warrior around. No, I agree Commander Dumbledore is a legend, however, he once said it himself. He considers Commander Mort to be his greatest rival. Now, history books tell us that Commander Mort was once part of a unit that captured a cult planet from Dragon Kevin 200+ years ago. He's a veteran and a true legend. The soldiers discussed, however, while competition among the righteous faction remained controlled and respectful, the same could not be said for the native barbarians of the pit, who watched the newcomers with open disdain as they leaned on stone pillars or perched on canyon ledges with mocking grins. These barbarians saw little value in uniformed armies, as they preferred strength proven in personal combat rather than in formation drills, and hence they made no effort to hide the amusement in their eyes while elite battalions passed them by. Some barbarians stepped forward deliberately to invade marching paths, as though daring the righteous soldiers to react, while others threw taunts laced with challenge, maybe hoping to provoke a duel that could end with one of them gaining a warrior's glory. However, despite the righteous soldiers burning with the urge to respond, as insults cut sharply across their pride, they forced themselves to remain composed, as their commanders absolutely forbade them from engaging in infighting. Do not engage. The commanders repeated, while soldiers clenched their jaws and walked on, each step heavier than the last as the barbarians, laughter followed them down the canyon roads. The barbarians on this planet are under Lord Helmuth's protection. Nobody is to harm them. The commanders reminded, as even the strongest elites were reduced to silence, as their discipline demanded obedience while their instincts screamed for retaliation, creating a tension that thickened the air wherever these two cultures crossed paths. As more fleets arrived, the encampments expanded outward in layered rings around the celestial judgment platform, while competing banners fluttered side by side in a manner that looked unified from afar yet carried countless rivalries beneath the surface. By dusk, billions of warriors had gathered, as the camps glowed with faint lights while conversations carried an undercurrent of anticipation, maybe even unease, since every soldier sensed that something far greater than a public execution was unfolding here. The pit had never witnessed such a concentrated gathering of military power before, and although the soldiers remained outwardly calm, the planet itself felt as though it had become a pressure chamber filled with pride, hostility, discipline, and expectations that continued to grow with every new arrival. Meanwhile, Helmuth did not appreciate all the military bustle currently ongoing. On his home world, as just like the barbarians living here, he much preferred the pit as a bloody, violent land where strength was proven through cracked bones and split skulls, and not through neatly arranged encampments and color-coded battalions marching in tidy lines. However, for the sake of killing Soren, he tolerated it nonetheless. I really hope Soren does show up after all I'm going to suffer these next few days, for if he doesn't, I might just have to kill Morris instead. He muttered while watching yet another fleet descend through the sulfur-streaked sky, his expression twisting with visible disgust as soldiers formed orderly queues near the volcanic rings, the exact opposite of everything the pit stood for. He crossed his arms as he studied the way Morris had positioned them all, as though the planet were being turned into a staged battlefield rather than the chaotic hellscape Helmuth preferred, yet even he could not deny that the layout carried a frightening degree of precision. Outer rings filled with Master and Grandmaster tiers, inner layers packed with Transcendence, and the core line stationed with Monarch-class elites. HMPH. The Deceiver has positioned them perfectly to activate the Chakravia. Helmuth grumbled as he narrowed his eyes, realizing that every soldier, every unit, and every commander had been placed deliberately, their combined aura lines forming an enormous spiraling construct of power that wrapped around the celestial judgment platform like a latent beast waiting to awaken. The fools don't even know they're standing inside a formation created by Morris. It's like the military stifled their independent thought, he said while clicking his tongue, as the soldiers continued to shuffle into their assigned sectors without any understanding that they were becoming pieces in a universal-scale military spell. On a personal level, he found it irritating, this order, this structure, this attempt to tame the pit's wild terrain into a formal execution stage, yet he understood why it was necessary, because if Soren truly appeared here, then only the combined pressure of billions arranged in a perfect formation could suppress him long enough for anyone to land the killing blow. Only a few days. I only need to stay calm for a few days, he reminded himself, as he forced himself to remain calm and not lash out. Chapter 856 Progress. Meanwhile, within the time-stilled world, Multhorak's floating island, Leo's POV. Leo sat cross-legged at the center of the chamber with his eyes half closed, as a thin veil of crimson haze slowly unfurled from his body, drifting outward with noticeably more control than the previous attempts, while Multhorak watched him from across the room with the quiet intensity of a teacher who had witnessed his number one student fail at the same stage countless times. However, unlike his first day trying this method, Leo no longer felt completely blind while trying to sense the fourth dimension. I can feel the first wall, he murmured, as he sensed the environment around him with a slow, cautious sweep of his aura, maybe hoping that the faint texture he detected earlier had not been his imagination, and to his relief there was indeed a slight disturbance in the air, barely perceptible yet unquestionably real. The aura extended again in a thin ribbon as Leo leaned deeper into the sensation, trying to listen not with his ears but with the killing intent circulating through him, and for a flicker of a moment the chamber around him no longer felt smooth and uniform but patterned, as if containing subtle points where the aura hesitated slightly before slipping past. It's faint, but it's there, Leo muttered as his brows tightened with concentration, because the wall he sensed currently was not physical, nor something he could ever touch, but a boundary of resistance that existed only as a whisper across the edges of his awareness. Multhorak murmured as he nodded slowly in acknowledgement, his enormous form shrinking into a more compact posture as his eyes gleamed with faint approval. You are beginning to sense the temporal grain, boy. Not clearly, but enough that you now understand what is real and what's not. You no longer mistake the noise of your own mind for what is truly there. Multhorak encouraged as Leo exhaled, allowing the aura to flow sideways instead of forward, as he tried to catch a second weak point. However, this time the haze wobbled slightly as if brushing against an uneven surface before settling again, giving him the unmistakable confirmation that it was not some accident. I felt it again, just a little dip, Leo whispered, half relieved and half annoyed, because although progress finally existed, it remained painfully elusive, like chasing shadows across a fogged window. Good, Multheric said as he traced a slow circle on the floor with his tail, but do not expect consistency yet. You are still a child trying to read weather patterns with your fingertips. Leo tried again, letting his aura expand in a broad sweep, but this time the haze met only uniform resistance. No dips, no tremors, nothing but the same blank air pressing evenly against him, and frustration tightened his chest as he opened his eyes slightly. TCH, it disappeared, he muttered as the haze flickered and lost its shape, collapsing back toward his skin. It did not disappear, Multheric corrected gently, you simply lost the sensitivity required to notice it. We are dealing in margins thinner than a breath, boy, and any turbulence in your mind disrupts the entire exercise. Leo gritted his teeth as he forced his eyes closed again, letting his aura soften until it behaved almost like silk rather than a blade, because Multheric had repeated that instruction enough times to make it echo in his skull. The haze drifted outward again. And this time, a tremor. Small, weak, inconsistent. But unmistakably real. I got it again, he whispered, the words escaping on instinct as relief washed through him, even if the sensation was still too faint to grasp fully. Multheric allowed himself a faint smile as he tilted his head. You are beginning to touch the edges of the fourth dimension. It is not mastery, not even close, but comprehension always begins in fragments. Leo let out another long breath as he continued sweeping his aura in slow arcs, trying to string the faint tremors together into a pattern, yet every attempt yielded only scattered results, as if each weak point was drifting away from him faster than he could recognize it. There's no rhythm to it, he muttered. I can't tell where the next one will be. Because you are not skilled enough yet, Multheric replied calmly. Even sensing scattered points is exceptional at your stage. Precision will come later, once you learn to refine your aura until it behaves like a needle instead of a wave. Leo groaned quietly. So I've barely taken the first step. Yes, Multheric said without hesitation, but it is a step that even king-tier warriors struggle to reach without guidance. Do not belittle what took you these last couple years to achieve. Leo remained quiet for a moment, letting the praise sink in rare, genuine, and grounding before he folded his legs tighter and steadied his breathing again. He swept his aura once more. Another tremor appeared, then vanished. Then a shallow dip surfaced near the northern wall, far weaker but still present. 3 ripples in one attempt. Not mastery, not clarity, but progress. All right, Leo murmured as a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I can work with this. Multheric nodded as he rose slowly, stretching his wings while keeping his eyes fixed on Leo's aura. You now possess the foundation to begin actual breakthroughs. And can now learn how to push through these weaknesses to open temporal gates. However, before we continue on to that stage, you need at least a month more to perfect this stage. But after that, you only need half a year more to master space tunneling, he said, as Leo let out a deep sigh. The finish line was now close, however, he still needed to make rapid progress to reach the end and meet his self-imposed deadline to lead the army out of the stilled world. Don't worry, cuz, I will save you anyhow. He vowed internally, as no matter what happened, he wanted to try his best to save there, and a key element of that outcome depended on him learning how to perform this move safely and consistently over a long time. Chapter 857 Urgent Message. Meanwhile, High Administrator Stratton's POV, Planet Zeta. High Administrator Stratton sat alone in his dimly lit office, as the towering glass panels behind him reflected the sprawling lights of Planet Zeta, one of the Universal Government's most important administrative hubs. Before him laid a data slate used only for sending highly sensitive righteous faction information, as he typed a weekly report on it, only for his typing to be interrupted by an urgent message. Beep beep. Code 53. The encryption was one he recognized instantly. A code reserved only for one informant. The Third Elder. A man who had fed the Universal Government covert cult intelligence for over a century now. An urgent message from Informant 53. Stratton wondered, as he straightened in his seat, the message unfolding before him line by line, as the secure encryption was decrypted. Respected High Administrator. It is with absolute certainty that I pass this message on to you. That the cult is preparing a massive retaliation on the very day Aegon Ver is to be executed on the pit. The message began, as Stratton's eyes narrowed as he leaned forward, the faint glow of the data slate dancing across his features while he continued reading with growing tension. Through highly confidential military documents intercepted within our command network, I have obtained confirmation that the cult has finalized plans to strike 12 righteous faction planets simultaneously. The attack is planned to be executed the moment the decapitation ceremony begins. The message read, as a chill slid down Stratton's spine. 12 at once, he wondered, as a list of targets appeared on his screen next. Targets include Planet Havren, Planet Aravex, Planet Juxtine, Fortress World Cadris, Planet Remora, Planet Verdanth, Mining Belt Route 12, Planet Yuldra, Planet Lokor, Planet Fenrith, Planet Muse, Planet Targos. Each name struck him like a blow, as he recognized the strategic weight behind them. Trade hubs, military staging zones, agricultural cores, and population centers that kept the righteous faction's infrastructure stable, and the cult planned on hitting them all. I always knew the cult was going to do something big in retaliation for us killing Vare, however, I never expected them to attempt something so bold. Stratton thought, as he grit his teeth and read the last paragraph with absolute attention. Based on intercepted mobilization orders, the cult is preparing to deploy an estimated force of 1 to 2 billion soldiers per target. The total mobilization is expected to exceed 20 billion troops. Regards, Third Elder. For several seconds, Stratton did not move. The lights of the city continued flickering behind him, however, in his chest there was nothing but a cold heaviness, as he realized the scale of what had just been revealed to him. A 12-planet simultaneous assault. 20 billion troops. On the very day the universe believed it would celebrate the end of the cult. Stratton clenched the message tablet tightly as he rose from his seat, pacing slowly across the polished floor while his mind raced through every protocol he had memorized in his decades of service. This cannot be ignored, he muttered, his voice low, almost strained, as he replayed the intel in his mind, maybe hoping he had misread it, while knowing full well that the Third Elder had never once sent false or exaggerated information. If anything, this was only the surface of a deeper plan, which was why he decided to report this urgently, as he forwarded the message through the highest priority channel. A channel reserved only for matters that threatened the stability of the entire righteous faction, as the system accepted the transmission. Instantly. Message sent. The system acknowledged, as within seconds, the message streaked across encrypted relay nodes, bypassing every bureaucratic layer in existence, as it reached straight into the hands of the very gods controlling the righteous faction, in the form of Caliph, Morris and Helmuth. Meanwhile, Morris felt a bottomless disappointment welling up inside him as the news of the cult's chosen path reached his ears. What a pity, what a real shame. He whispered, shaking his head slowly, almost rhythmically, as if repeating the motion enough times might somehow coax the cult into rewriting its intentions, yet no matter how long he lingered in that futile gesture, the reality remained stubborn and dull. The cult was planning to attack 12 righteous faction planets instead of trying to storm the pit, which meant that he was not going to get the grand showdown that he truly wanted on the pit. I understand it, of course. He rasped, letting the rain slide across his bare skin while his words drifted lazily into the wind. From a strategic point of view, retaliation is wiser than rescue, but I had hoped for more entertainment. Or at least for more chaos. He said, as he let out a deep sigh. So in the end, Soren will try to save Vare alone. That's so like him, always sparing his men, always refusing pointless deaths, always predictable in the most heroic, boring way. He mused, as the more he thought about it, the more his frustration simmered, as if the universe had handed him a stage and an audience but denied him the performance he truly wanted, leaving only practical decisions behind that tasted like stale air. I suppose I'll have to redirect some forces to the targeted worlds, he murmured, rubbing his thumb idly along the ridge of his knuckle, otherwise Caliph would be terribly disappointed in me, and we can't have that right before this big fight. He said, as he lingered for a moment longer, the rain tracing silent lines down his face as he wrestled with the dull weight of obligation, before finally issuing the order to reroute the already stretched thin righteous faction forces toward the 12 threatened planets, a decision that potentially left entire regions of the universe exposed like open wounds. Ha, ha ha ha. A small, humorless smile tugged at his lips as the commands went through. So predictable, all of us, so boring, he murmured softly, as the world around him darkened just a shade more. Chapter 858 An Aging Soldier. Meanwhile, Chaosbringer's paw, the time-stilled world. Chaosbringer sat alone in his quiet office, leaning back in his chair with his arms folded tightly across his chest, as he kept himself a small distance away from the cluttered work desk stacked with sealed reports and pending approvals, while his mind drifted through the tangled web of secrets he had spent the past year unraveling with unwavering, almost obsessive patience. It had taken him months to track the faint trails of deceit, weeks of observing subtle inconsistencies repeat themselves like hairline cracks in a porcelain mask, until eventually he confirmed what he had suspected from the start, that the Third Elder had been leaking information to the outside world in ways so careful and deliberate that even Chaosbringer's hidden observers had failed to catch him in the act. He remembered how exhausting it had been to play along, as he fed the traitor carefully crafted fragments of false intelligence, each one woven into a larger illusion designed to mislead the righteous faction piece by piece, until all the threads finally converged yesterday with the fabricated report about 12 righteous planets set to be attacked on the same day as Ver's execution. That was the moment Chaosbringer decided the man had served his final purpose. "You were a snake I wanted to eliminate a long time ago, and tonight you shall finally be gone," he murmured, almost gently, as he acknowledged that there was nothing left to extract from the Third Elder anymore, no false trail left to exploit, which was why he had not hesitated even for a breath before signing the death warrant a few moments ago. "The bait I cast for the righteous faction is flawless, so flawless that not a single commander up there will ever question the legitimacy of my true plans," he whispered, a pleased warmth settling behind his eyes, as he thought about how perfectly the information had been shaped to appeal to their logic and paranoia alike. Every calculation, every ounce of common sense dictates that the cult should strike those 12 planets, and so they will rush to reinforce them desperately, bleeding their already strained ranks until entire regions lie bare for our allies, the Sioux clan, to sweep through untouched. He continued in a soft, satisfied tone, as if savoring the elegance of a long-awaited performance finally moving toward its crescendo, while the smallest curl of a smile formed at the corner of his lips. "I've removed most of the elders, council in the last year, the 1st, 2nd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 8th, 9th and 10th, he mused, letting the names roll off his tongue like fading stains. "Once the 3rd is erased as well, the old guard will finally be gone, and with their purged remains, the political rot corroding the cult will end," he said, as he finally pushed himself up from the chair with a slow, deliberate motion, his steps carrying him away from the drifts of paperwork and toward the far wall of his office where a large portrait of Leo hung in quiet reverence, illuminated only by the dim amber light of a single floating lamp. Chaosbringer stopped before it and let out a long, trembling sigh, the kind that escaped only when no one was watching. "My lord," he whispered, the words thin and reverent, as his gaze drifted down to his own hand, a hand that once moved with youthful precision yet now carried faint wrinkles along the knuckles, tiny signs of decay that time had carved into him despite all his efforts to ignore it. He rotated his wrist slowly, studying the texture of his skin as an unpleasant truth settled upon him, because unlike the powerful warriors who fought beside Leo, unlike the blacksmiths who could elongate their lifespan with increased mastery in their craft, or the ancient beings who served Leo's cause with near-immortal longevity, he was nothing more than a normal human. A normal human who was aging fast. A normal human who, at best, had 20 or 25 years left before his body began to betray him completely, leaving him too frail and too brittle to continue serving the man whose portrait he now stood before. "It is cruel, my lord, but it seems I will not be able to serve you forever, even though every part of me wishes to," he murmured, as his fingers brushed the bottom edge of the portrait frame, maybe hoping that through touch alone he could feel closer to the man he worshipped, while the quiet acceptance of his own mortality gnawed at him from the inside. His eyes dimmed as he thought about what came next, because if he could not remain at Leo's side until the end, then he needed to ensure that someone capable would stand where he once stood, shaping the cult from the shadows the same way he had done most his life. "I must find a successor worthy of you, someone who understands your greatness, someone who will not falter when the universe begins to worship you as its overlord," he whispered, as his mind drifted through names none of which satisfied him, because none of them possessed the devotion, the vision, or the ruthlessness required to serve Leo with the same unwavering loyalty that he did. And before my time runs out, I must consolidate every piece of influence I have gathered, purge every last remnant of the old guard, stabilize the internal power structure, and ensure that when you return to take over the cult, that you find it worthy of you. He said softly, his voice trembling not with fear but with devotion, as he lowered his head, as though offering a silent vow to the portrait before him. For even though he knew that his years were numbered, Chaosbringer's resolve did not weaken. If anything, the ticking clock only hardened it further. Because he wanted to achieve everything he could, destroy what needed to be destroyed, build what needed to be built, and shape the cult into an organization that was a net asset to Leo and not a liability. And if achieving that dream meant that he had to burn through the last remaining years of his life to make that future real, then he was prepared for that as well. Chapter 859 The World Beyond. A few months later, within the time-stilled world, Multhorak's floating island, Leo's POV. Leo stood with his palms faintly open as a steady current of crimson aura flowed out of him in a thin, controlled stream, drifting through the chamber like a searching tendril, while Multhorak observed him with expectant eyes, as he could see that Leo was close to the breakthrough he had waited months for. Over the past few cycles, the faint tremors Leo detected had grown clearer and more frequent, as the once fragmented sensations slowly began aligning into patterns, until standing here today he could trace not just scattered weak points but full sequences of them lodged along the invisible fabric of the fourth dimension. There, another one, Leo murmured as his aura brushed against a shallow dip, then another one a short distance away, as this time the points began to form a curve, almost like the ridge of a hidden pathway carved into the darkness behind the three-dimensional world. You are correct, Multhorak said as he nodded slowly and stepped ahead. You now sense them consistently and accurately enough for us to move on to the next stage. Leo's eyes sharpened as he straightened slightly, because he knew what the next stage was, and he had been waiting for this moment ever since he first sensed the temporal grain. You have spent years learning how to detect the weak points, but detecting alone is worthless unless you learn how to pierce through them. So now we begin the true act of space tunneling, which is learning how to break through the dimensional wall. Multhorak explained as Leo exhaled softly and retracted his aura, only to then unfurl it again in a tighter ribbon, as he hoped that it remained stable enough for the demonstration. So, how do I break it? He asked. Push, tear, shatter, he inquired as Multhorak shook his head slowly in denial. None of those. The fourth dimension does not behave like matter. You cannot tear what you cannot grasp. You must strike it with precision, not force, which is why you will shape your aura into a single condensed point. He explained as he lifted a claw and tapped the air. Form a hammer, or an arrow, or a dagger, whichever shape is easier for your instincts. The idea is the same. You take all the aura you possess, every drop of killing intent, every grain of spiritual pressure, and compact it until it becomes dense enough to crack the membrane. He instructed as Leo nodded quietly before extending his aura in the shape of a dagger. Thrum, thrum. The air around him vibrated as he compressed it tighter and tighter until a needle-like point shimmered faintly as his dagger's tip, its edges vibrating with unstable focus. Good. Now listen carefully, because this is the part that determines whether you live or suffer a fate far worse. Multhorak lowered his voice as the chamber dimmed slightly. The biggest worry when performing space tunneling is that, the moment you step into the fourth dimension, the very fabric of the universe begins to notice you. Multhorak began, as Leo's brows drew together in confusion. I don't know how else to put it. However, simply said, the moment the membrane breaks, cosmic backlash will strike and the void beyond your perception will try to swallow your consciousness whole. If you face it bare, you will feel a loneliness so absolute that your mind will believe that the universe has abandoned you, and it is possible that you will never return from that sensation intact. Multhorak warned, as Leo gulped hard. Gulp. Then how do I endure it? He asked, as, you do not endure it, you block it. Came the reply almost immediately. Before you strike the weak point, you must activate your aura shield, because that shield will absorb the backlash, numbing it, softening it, preventing the void from touching your mind. For without the shield, the backlash will imprint directly onto your consciousness, and you will be crushed beneath the illusion of eternal isolation. Leo's grip tightened as he pictured the sensation, the universe going silent, every sound vanishing, every sense stripped until only the Endless cold remained. Is that what happens to warriors who fail? He asked quietly, as Multhorak's expression darkened. Some lose their speech for months, others scream for nights on end, and a few never emerge again. The void makes them believe they were born alone and will die alone, and that truth breaks them. Huff. Leo inhaled deeply, steadying his breath. So step 1, sense the weak point. Step 2, form the dagger. Step 3, cloak myself in the aura shield. Step 4, strike. Step 5, step in. Exactly, Multhorak said as he nodded in agreement. And today, you will open up the fourth dimension, however, you will not step into it. Multhorak instructed, as Leo closed his eyes and unraveled his aura-like silk around him, layering itself across his skin until the familiar pressure of the shield wrapped around him, snug and reassuring, like armor forged from his own will. All right, let's do this. He muttered as the weak point flickered again, a soft tremor near the far wall, as he shaped his aura into a condensed dagger and drove it forward with absolute precision, the point humming sharply as it cut through the unseen membrane. Crack. The world did not simply split, it vibrated, as though the entire chamber were a taut string plucked by an unseen hand, the floor buzzing beneath his feet while the walls rippled faintly as if made of stretched liquid instead of stone, as the very air thickened in an instant, turning dense and heavy like a storm collapsing inward. FSSHH. The tear widened a fraction as a thin, wobbling line of distorted light carved itself across space, bending the chamber around it into impossible shapes. Straight edges curved, shadows elongated and twisted upward, while colors bled into each other as if the laws of vision had begun to unravel. A low-pressure throb pulsed outward from the crack, making Leo's ears ring as the oxygen around him seemed to thin, each breath tasting colder and emptier than the last, as though the rupture were sucking the warmth straight out of existence. What is this pressure? Leo mused, as it was at that moment that the cosmic backlash struck. BZZT. The sensation was unlike usual sound or force, almost as if it were a silent tidal wave crashing directly against his consciousness, a crushing presence that pressed against his thoughts and tried to hollow them out, whispering of endless emptiness where no stars were born and no voices ever existed. But thankfully for him the aura shield held, as although the crushing weight pressed against his consciousness, it soon dissolved and was absorbed by the shield before it could reach his thoughts, leaving behind only a faint ringing in his ears instead of the suffocating dread that should have accompanied it. Ha! Asterisk. Leo gasped softly as the crack widened for a fraction of a second, revealing a swirling void beyond immense, cold, endless before collapsing shut with a violent snap. Swoop. Multhorak nodded. That was your first tear in the dimensional wall. Clumsy, unstable, incomplete, but good enough. He encouraged, as Leo exhaled long and slow, his chest burning with a strange blend of exhaustion and excitement, as he saw a glimpse of the world beyond for the first time ever. Chapter 860 Navigating the Fourth Dimension. Multhorak's Floating Island, Leo's POV. So, since I can open the dimensional tunnel now, am I finally ready to step into it? Leo asked with a hint of restrained excitement, as Multhorak let out a deep, rolling chuckle, the kind that made the chamber vibrate faintly as the old dragon swiped his tail across the floor in open amusement, his expression dripping with contempt for the question itself. Are you ready to step into it? Multhorak repeated slowly, almost savoring the words before his amusement burst out again. Ha 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 ha. Oh, boy, no. No, you most certainly are not. Leo frowned slightly as Multhorak leaned closer, lowering his massive head until his golden eyes were level with Leo's own, the casual disdain in his tone so sharp that for a moment Leo wondered if the dragon was genuinely insulted. You still do not know how to navigate the tunnel. Multhorak said, his each word slow and deliberate, as though explaining the obvious to a stubborn child. So what in the seven forgotten hells will you even do after entering it? Float around blindly. Pray you drift in the right direction. Or do you simply wish to die a very poetic, very lonely death? He asked as Leo opened his mouth to respond, only to be cut off again. No, don't bother answering. Multhorak muttered with a scoff. Because unless you want to be ejected at a completely random point in space, or spiral straight into a void whirlpool, or get trapped in a region with no exit cracks for all eternity, then you still have much to learn before you can take even a single step into that dimension. He said, as he shook his head as if disappointed that the question had even been asked. Opening the tunnel is the easy part, boy. Entering it safely is an art. Surviving inside it is a masterstroke. And exiting where you intended is a miracle you achieve only with absolute precision. Multheric settled back slightly, crossing one wing over the other in his version of folded arms, as his voice grew softer but heavier. You have learned to knock on the fourth dimension. That is all. But if you jump inside without knowing how to control where you emerge. He flicked a claw, as if brushing an insect away. Then even I would not be able to retrieve whatever scraps remain of you. He warned as he tapped one claw against the floor, causing tiny ripples of aura to scatter outward like faint echoes of a lecture he had repeated to countless warriors long before Leo had ever been born. Listen carefully now, boy, because this is where real space tunneling begins, he said, his tone shifting from mockery to something colder and more authoritative, as though the air itself tightened around his words. The tunnel you opened today was nothing but a doorway, one entrance with no defined exit because you have not yet carved the path between point A and point B. Leo blinked, trying to visualize it, but Multherac's gaze sharpened before he could even ask another question. The fourth dimension is not a corridor, Multheric continued, it is a sea, a vast, directionless sea with no up, no down, no left, no right, and no landmarks to guide you. If you enter without preparation, you will float endlessly, pulled around by currents you cannot see and forces you cannot fight. He swiped his tail through the air, and Leo watched the motion distort as though passing through water, bending unnaturally before snapping back into place. In these currents the cosmic tides and folds will throw you in whichever direction they please, Multheric said, which means you might exit a few steps from where you intended, or you might exit on the opposite side of the universe entirely. Leo felt his stomach tighten. So how do I decide where the exit is? He asked cautiously. Multherac's lips lifted slightly, not in a smile but in the way a teacher smirked when a student finally approached the right question. You control the distance by controlling the entry angle, he said, raising one claw. The direction, however, is controlled by the vector you imprint onto your aura before you strike the weak point. Leo frowned slightly as Multheric elaborated, his words flowing with heavy precision. Think of the dimensional tunnel as a slope layered behind reality. A shallow angle sends you a short distance. A steeper angle sends you farther. Too steep, and you overshoot entirely and emerge fate knows where. Too shallow, and you break the membrane only to pop out a meter away like a confused rabbit. He tapped the ground again. Your job is to calculate the correct angle and imprint it onto your aura before the strike, because once the tunnel opens, there is no adjusting it. The dimensional path is forged instantly, one motion, one result, no corrections allowed. Leo swallowed hard at the weight behind that rule. And the vector? He asked softly. The vector determines your direction. It is carved by your mastery over your aura, where if you can control it precisely, you will move as you intended. Whereas if you can't, you will have a very bumpy ride. Multheric said as he leaned in closer, his enormous head casting a shadow over Leo. This is why tunnel navigation is the most important part of the art. Even if you open the tunnel flawlessly, even if your shield holds perfectly, even if you resist the backlash, none of it matters if you cannot control your exit point. A warrior who exits 5 kilometers off target is useless. A warrior who exits 5,000 kilometers off target is dead. Leo took a slow breath, letting the magnitude of that truth settle in. So what do I learn first? He asked as Multherac's eyes brightened with approval. We begin with angles, he said. You will learn to strike weak points at controlled degrees, 5 degrees, 10 degrees, 15 degrees until your aura obeys you without error. After that, we begin working on vectors, because only once both are mastered will you be allowed to step into the tunnel. His voice softened, though not kindly, merely with the gravity of reality. Understand this, boy. One mistake in calculation and you could emerge inside a star, or inside a planet's crust, or in an airless vacuum that rips your lungs apart before you can even summon your shield. The universe does not forgive miscalculations. Leo closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself. All right, then teach me how to calculate the first angle. He requested, as Multheric grinned in approval. Good, at least you have the heart for it. I've seen many drop their balls at this part, he encouraged, as he began explaining the next phase of Leo's training. Chapter 861, Hoping for Chaos. Meanwhile, On planet Su Prime, Patriarch Su Tang's POV. Su Tang sat upon the Su family throne with an eyebrow raised in disbelief, as the chief strategist finished reading the final lines of the report, his voice stiff and reluctant, as though he himself struggled to accept the words leaving his tongue. Patriarch, it seems the information sent to us by the cultists is not wrong. The universal government and the remaining great clans have already pulled vast numbers of troops from across the universe to station them on the pit, which has already stretched their defenses slightly. However, now with the cult's new revenge threat, they have diverted even more forces to safeguard the 12 targeted planets, giving us a golden opportunity to raid practically defenseless worlds. He reported, as Su Tang lifted a fist to his chin, letting out a long, headache-filled sigh while his gaze drifted across the towering hall lined with Su banners that fluttered faintly in the artificial breeze. Have you independently verified all this? He asked quietly, as the strategist stiffened, lowering his head in acknowledgement. I have, Lord Patriarch. Cross-checked 5 times, through 3 independent networks, all the information matches. He replied, though his expression twisted slightly, as if confirming this truth violated every instinct he had cultivated in a lifetime of distrusting the cult. If this were a couple of years ago, I would never use information that originated from the cult to guide a clan decision. It would have been unthinkable, reckless, shameful even. He admitted, his words thick with unwilling acceptance. However, as things stand, I suppose we have no choice but to trust those damn cultists. After all, the plan they sent us is too good to pass on. Su Tang exhaled again, a breath heavy enough to echo through the quiet hall, as he leaned backward slightly, his fingers drumming lightly against the arm of the throne while the weight of the situation settled deeper into him. As matters stood, the Su clan controlled only 4 planets, barely enough to sustain their population, and lacked the manpower, resources, or political leverage to seize and hold any additional territory. Their expansion prospects were bleak, their future even more so. But the cult's proposal did not demand conquest. It demanded chaos. Instead of occupying planets, the Su clan was to strike them like bandits of the stars and carry out swift raids, targeted plundering, extraction of valuables, and immediate retreat before reinforcements could return. In short, a full-scale blitz of destruction, that was to unfold across an entire day and night. A single 24-hour storm of flames and looting that could feed the Su clan for a decade. Sigh. Su Tang sighed again, deeper this time, as he considered the implications, moral, political, and practical, yet every angle of the situation pulled him to the same inevitable conclusion, as though the universe itself had arranged a feast before a starving man. The opportunity was simply too good for him to pass on. And hence, after thinking about it at length, he simply nodded, the tension in the hall releasing just slightly as the strategist straightened in anticipation. All right, Su Tang said slowly, the decision tasting both exciting and necessary on his tongue, invite the War Council for a session tomorrow. We will discuss the specifics and finalize the deployment. He paused, one last sigh escaping him as he rubbed the bridge of his nose. I suppose the Su clan will soon be raiding the universe, just like the cult wants. He acknowledged, as surprisingly, he decided to follow Chaosbringer's suggestion down to the T. Meanwhile, the 5-God Summit, secure astral projection channel. A soft hum filled the astral chamber as 5 divine projections formed around a circular table of shimmering light, their silhouettes stabilizing one by one until the gods of the 5 great clans faced one another with guarded expressions. Lu Han broke the silence first. So what is the verdict on our involvement in Soren's killing? Do we go all out from the start, or do we allow Helmuth to face him alone? First, Lu Han asked, as his gaze drifted from one projection to another, already knowing the answer but wanting it spoken aloud. Helmuth will demand a solo battle. He has been waiting centuries to test himself against Soren, Mu Shen said, as he folded his arms with mild annoyance, since stopping the barbarian god from doing what he wanted was nearly impossible. To be honest, I would not be troubled if Helmuth dies. Dutrask said, as he leaned back with a casual sharpness that made the others exchange brief glances of quiet agreement. Without him, the 5 of us can finally break free from the universal government's weight. Kalith and Morris alone cannot stop us if we move together, Lu Han said, as Ruvasa nodded slowly while tapping her finger against the astral table. We have followed orders long enough. Helmuth is the only one among them I genuinely fear, so if Soren kills him, the balance shifts in our favor. Ruvasa said, as Yukiro tilted his head thoughtfully. Let us not pretend any of us want Helmuth to survive this. Yukiro said, as his projection flickered softly in quiet agreement from the others. Then we must decide if we intervene early or stay back and let Soren clash with him first. Mu Shen said, as Dutrask's projection brightened slightly. Soren is more likely to go straight for Kalith, given the history, so it's unclear if Helmuth will even have the one-on-one that he wants so badly. However, just in case he does, I personally don't see a scenario where he comes out the victor against Soren. Dutrask said, as Ruvasa sighed faintly. Helmuth would rather die than allow another god to join the fight he claimed for himself. Ruvasa said, as Yukiro traced a faint circle on the table. If Helmuth dies, we are free. If he wins, he will be too injured to resist when we descend together, so if one of us gets our hands on the weapon that he used to kill Soren, or the one that Soren used to kill him, then we can truly change the face of the battle. Yukiro said, as the logic settled comfortably among them. Luhan nodded once. Kalith will not like it, but even he cannot alter what happens in the arena. Helmuth will step in first, and if destiny wishes it, he will fall. Luhan said, as Mu Shen released a long breath. So our plan remains the same. Helmuth and Soren weaken each other. Once one collapses, we step in. Mu Shen said, as Dutrask allowed himself a thin smile. Let the barbarian god die proving his pride. And let Soren understand that victory earns him nothing. Dutrask said, as Yukiro lowered his gaze slightly. Once Helmuth falls, the universe shifts. Once Soren falls, the cult collapses. And what remains will belong to us, the great clans. Yukiro said, as Ruvasa glanced around the circle. Then it is settled. Helmuth fights first. If he dies, so be it. When he falls, we strike Soren together. Ruvasa said, as her words sealed the unspoken pact forming between them. One by one, their projections dimmed and dissolved, leaving the astral chamber quiet once more. A fragile alliance had been forged in whispers, and though none said it aloud, every god present hoped the same thing. That somehow, Helmuth died first. Chapter 862 Belief. Meanwhile, across the neutral worlds, cult commoners, the crackdowns began quietly at first, a few extra patrol drones circling above the markets, a few more guards stationed at the spaceport entrances, but within just a handful of days the difference became impossible to ignore, as the neutral planets that once served as safe shelters for scattered cult refugees now pulsed with an uneasiness thick enough to taste in the air. Step, step, step. A woman hurried through the open market of Tythera's lower ring with her hood pulled low, pausing only when another cloaked figure tugged her gently aside into the shadow of a closed stall. It has become worse since Lord Shadow Dragon struck those planets, the figure whispered, his voice strained as he checked the corners before continuing. They are searching harder now. Anyone who looks even slightly suspicious is taken in for questioning. The woman nodded once, her eyes tight with both fear and pride. We all cheered when we heard he made them bleed, she said softly, but now we must be cautious. They are frightened, and frightened people do reckless things. Her companion did not disagree, but before either could speak again, a young messenger boy rushed past them with a half-empty crate, his whisper carrying just enough strength to reach their ears. He destroyed 2 planets alone, they call him the Demon of Omega. Now, and in my understanding, they fear him as much as Lord Soren now, he said as he darted by, his footsteps quick and nervous. The 2 adults watched him disappear into the crowd before exchanging a somber glance. Children should not need to know such things, the woman murmured. Children of the cult have always known too much, the man replied, as he let out a deep sigh. If possible, the elders wanted to give the children a sheltered and golden childhood like every other parent. However, unfortunately for the cult's sympathizers, a sheltered childhood was a luxury that they could not afford for their kids. Step, bustle, stumble. Soon, the world around the duo shifted with the movement of the crowd, and their conversation dissolved into the marketplace noise, yet the same words echoed elsewhere almost identically, carrying from one corner of the plaza to the next, like a rumor traveling on the wind. Inside a nearby tavern, the same unease hung heavy over dim lantern light and chipped tables. Miners, merchants, and refugees sat clustered together, speaking in low tones that blended seamlessly with the murmurs outside the building, each sentence picking up where another dropped off in the streets, creating a continuous river of anxious voices. "Border checks doubled again today," a miner muttered as he pressed his cup against his lips. "They stopped everyone on my transport. Asked for lineage records, demanded to know which clans our grandparents belonged to." His companion shook his head in disbelief. "They are not even pretending anymore. The execution date of the dragon is drawing close, and they think we will riot or run or summon the cult's armies." An elderly man at the next table turned slightly toward them, his voice carrying the weary authority of someone who had survived the crackdown of local authorities for decades now. "They fear what happens after the execution. The cult without a leader will become a rogue organization. And they don't like that," the old man said, as a young woman beside him leaned forward, her voice unsteady but full of yearning. "Do you think they will save him? The dragon? Or do you believe it too? Be impossible?" she asked as the old man did not answer immediately. For a while, there was but silence in the tavern, until eventually the old man spoke again. "I want to believe that they will," he began, as he looked straight towards the ceiling. "I want to believe that the brotherhood within the cult transcends what is possible or impossible. However, those are just fantasies. The reality is that the righteous faction has called everyone to that damned planet. The great clans, their commanders, the universal government, soldiers, every weapon they own. The pit is a fortress now. And saving Lord Dragon from it will not be easy, not easy at all." He shared, as the young woman lowered her gaze, but before fear could fully settle into her expression, another voice spoke from deeper inside the room. "They will try," a man said as he polished his worn gloves. "They must try. He saved us, hid us, protected us, fed us when no one else would. If the cult abandons him now, then what meaning do we have left?" A quiet ripple passed through the tavern, a shared breath of agreement that felt almost ceremonial. As people got up to leave, the tavern door opened and the sounds of the outside streets flowed back in, creating a seamless continuation of the ongoing conversation that seemed to cover the entire district. The voices outside echoed the same sentiments, the same fears, the same hopes, as two merchants closing their kiosks lowered their voices as they worked. "I heard the righteous faction brought half their elites to that cursed planet," one whispered. "They are preparing for war, not an execution." The second merchant nodded grimly. "They know the cult will not sit quietly. Something will happen. And, whatever it is, the universe will shake." Further down the street, in a cramped residential quarter where dozens of displaced families lived stacked atop one another in converted cargo pods, people spoke in hushed tones through cracked doors and narrow windows, their words drifting upward like incense. "They say Lord Dragon has been chained for months. They say he was tortured. They say the cult is quiet only because something massive is coming. They say Lord Soren will tear the sky apart to reach him. They say the day is almost here." Whispers, rumors, prayers, warnings. Fear and faith interwoven so tightly that neither could be separated from the other. Every cult-born heart on every neutral world felt the same approaching storm, a storm none of them could see yet all of them recognized instinctively. And in every home, every tavern, every alleyway, every hidden corner of every neutral planet, the same final line was spoken with trembling hope. "Whatever happens on the day of the execution, the universe will remember it forever. Because even frightened, hunted, and scattered across the void, the cult still believed their dragon could still be saved." Chapter 863 First Leap. Meanwhile, Multhorak's floating island, Leo's POV. Leo stood on the edge of the floating island with his heartbeat drumming louder than usual, as Multhorak loomed behind him with a watching stillness. The old dragon had deemed him ready to make his first jump, and hence, he prepared for it with bated breath. Step 1, conjure the aura shield. He thought, as he tightened and reshaped his aura into a thin, focused layer meant to protect his mind from whatever the fourth dimension attempted to imprint upon him. "Today is different from the previous attempts, boy," Multhorak said as he settled onto his coils, the ancient dragon's voice echoing faintly through the open island. "Today, you are not just knocking on the door of the fourth dimension, but rather stepping through it, even if only for a breath." Gulp. Leo swallowed once as he nodded, his aura flaring softly in acknowledgement as it flowed around him like living silk trying to search for weak spots in the fourth-dimensional membrane around him. So the exit is 500 kilometers from here? Leo asked, as he exhaled sharply to steady his nerves. Exactly 542, Multheric corrected with a low rumble of amusement. A short hop. A child's step. But for your first entry, it is enough, he said as Leo lifted his hand and let the aura pull into his palm, compressing into a dense dagger shape, as Multheric watched the angle of Leo's stance with sharp scrutiny. Remember, Multheric said, a shallow entry angle for a short distance. Too deep, and you will shoot past the mark. Too shallow, and you will barely leave the terrace. I know, Leo replied quietly, as he traced that mental slope in his mind again, shaping it as Multheric had taught him, a gentle downward angle, almost like skipping a stone across still water, something that sliced the membrane without diving too far inside. His aura stiffened, ready to strike. Very well, Multheric murmured, open it. Leo's breath trembled once as he thrust the aura dagger forward. Cack. The world rippled at once, violently but beautifully, as a thin rupture tore through the surface of reality, the surrounding air bending inward like fabric pulled into a whirlpool, while the pressure of the island thickened in response, turning every breath into a weight he needed to push through. CRRRSH. The fourth dimension stirred behind the crack, shimmering with that same impossible distortion Leo had glimpsed before, yet this time the void did not remain on the other side of a window. This time, it pulled at him as if beckoning him to enter. Step through, Multheric commanded, as Leo inhaled sharply and leapt. The world vanished instantly. No sound, no weight, no direction, just a sensation of falling without falling, moving without motion, as the space around him stretched like liquid glass that folded inward like a twisting ribbon. His body lost the meaning of left or right or forward or backward, as if he were drifting through a sea with no water to hold him and no gravity to guide him. *FSSSHH. Colors flickered at the edges of his vision, colors he knew yet somehow did not recognize, mixing with shadows that refused to behave like shadows at all, as though the fourth dimension rejected the idea of silhouettes and instead painted disturbances rather than shapes. *BZZZT. A faint hum vibrated against his aura shield, brushing against him like someone whispering directly into the fabric of his thoughts, as if testing him, probing him, trying to seep past the shield wrapped around his mind, as Leo clenched his fist tighter. Clench. He could feel the tunnel's slope guiding him, that very angle he carved into the membrane earlier pulling him downward in a smooth glide, almost like sliding along a blade-thin current. So this is it, he whispered, even though no sound should have existed here, this is the fourth dimension. He observed, as the tunnel bent slightly, responding to his exit vector. FSSHH. A subtle tug pulled him forward. A subtle tremor that hinted that the exit was near, as he sliced his dagger through the very next weak point he found, which caused light to return from the other side. FWIP. Leo burst out of the dimensional tear in a flash of distorted air, tumbling forward with a gasp as the rupture sealed behind him with a soft, elastic snap, sending a shockwave that disturbed the ocean. Beneath him, splash. He landed straight into the vast ocean exactly 542 kilometers from the floating island, as his hair and body became drenched by the tainted water of the stilled world. I did it. I successfully navigated a space tunnel, he thought, as his heart pounded with joy while his mind pulsed with adrenaline. 542 kilometers in a single step. Ha ha ha, ha 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 ha. He chuckled, as his breath came in controlled bursts as he ran a hand through his wet hair, still trying to absorb what he had just done. However, before he could celebrate too much, a loud boom sound interrupted his thoughts. Boom. A sudden boom of displaced air erupted behind him as Multheric appeared through a separate tunnel, landing gracefully with wings half spread, his golden eyes gleaming with approval. You did not collapse. You did not lose your way. And you did not scream, Multheric said, as he approached with a heavy, rumbling satisfaction. For a first leap, boy, that is more than enough. Leo exhaled again, this time with a trembling smile, because even though it lasted barely a breath, he had tasted the impossible. He had stepped into a world that lay beyond a normal human's senses. And survived to tell the tale. Now, we teach you how to do it again, and again, until it becomes second nature to you. Multheric instructed, as Leo nodded slowly, the hunger in his eyes returning as he felt fired up to finish this last phase of his training as fast as possible so that he could finally be with his army. Chapter 864 Mistake. 7 days later, Multhorax Island, Leo's POV. Over the next 7 days, Leo made rapid progress in his mastery over space tunneling, as not only did he refine the precision of his entry angles and strengthen the density of his aura dagger, he also learned to calculate and lock the ending vector with growing confidence, allowing him to appear within meters of where he intended rather than drifting into the vastness of the stilled world like a lost shadow. Day after day, leap after leap, he carved through the fourth dimension with anxious focus, as the slopes he created became cleaner, the tunnels he opened stretched farther, and the fear that once seized his chest slowly dissolved into a careful, disciplined excitement that only came when a warrior began to trust his own instincts. By the 5th day, he was opening tunnels nearly 10,000 kilometers long. By the 6th, he could land himself on specific reefs around the stilled world's broken ocean. By the 7th, he began hitting targets smaller than Multhorac's claw, 3 times in a row. And that was when the confidence began to creep in. Good, Multheric said on the morning of the 8th day, his tone proud yet cautious as Leo returned from another successful leap. Your technique has stabilized nicely. I think we are ready to jump between planets now, and once you master the 2 in a week or so, your training will finally be complete. He instructed as Leo nodded in agreement. Each successful tunnel made the next feel easier, smoother, almost natural to him, as though the 4th dimension was beginning to accept his presence rather than resisting it. So when Multheric suggested interplanet travel, he felt no fear for it, just excitement. To calculate the precise exit vector for interplanet travel, you need to learn how to read the universal chart. It is a traveler's guide created back when I was one of the rulers of the universe, which allowed the dragon army to raid enemy worlds. It was auto-adjusting, so it should be precise even today, despite the planets having shifted from their original location. Multheric shared, as he gave Leo a copy of the universal chart, which clearly showed all the entry slopes and distance vectors one needed to follow to achieve precise interplanet travel. Oh wow, this is really easy to read and follow. Leo shared, as surprisingly, since he was proficient in reading the ancient language, he did not struggle much at all in grasping how to use the universal chart, as he quickly chartered a course for Ixtal. Can you confirm I'm doing this correctly? He asked, as Multheric looked at his calculations and nodded. To travel from the stilled world to Ixtal, he needed to slice into the 4th dimension at a 31.45 degrees slope, and had to break through exactly 1788 barriers to reach the planet's surface. If he exited at 1787, he would find himself suspended in the upper atmosphere, while 1789 would bury him inside the planet's core, which meant that the room for error was next to none. Don't lose track of the mental count of how many barriers you passed through. And remember, all temporal membranes need to be sliced exactly at a precise 31.45 degrees slope. 1523. A single mistake in space tunneling can be deadly. Multheric warned, as Leo took his warning to heart and nodded. I won't make a mistake. I've got this. 2/6, he said confidently, as he shaped his aura shield, before then forming the aura dagger out of habit. 28, 29, 30, 31.31.45 degrees. He measured, before committing the angle to muscle memory, as he thrust at the same angle again and again without making even the slightest mistake. Focus fully, your hand is too relaxed. If you go about space tunneling so casually, you're bound to make a mistake somewhere. Multheric reminded from behind him, as, don't worry old dragon, I am fully focused, Leo answered, as he tightened his grip. Cack. He thrust forward, opening the space tunnel as practiced, before stepping into it with confidence, as he waved the old dragon goodbye. For a while, everything seemed normal, as he began to slice through the temporal membranes one after another with absolute precision. However, as he crossed what should have been the 73rd membrane, his aura dagger surprisingly sliced forward and met no resistance at all, as the expected soft tremor simply failed to appear, as though the very fabric of the tunnel had thinned beneath his touch. Strange, maybe an irregular gap, he thought, as he took another step, expecting the next barrier to greet him with its usual faint ripple, Yet once again his dagger struck nothing but open dimensional air, the slope beneath him smoothing out unnaturally as if wiped clean. He frowned lightly and continued walking, counting in his mind with the same steady rhythm he had practiced 1,000 times this week. 74, 75, 76. Still nothing. A tight coil of unease twisted inside him, but he exhaled slowly, reassuring himself that anomalies could occur, since Multheric had mentioned odd gaps that were rare but harmless. So he stepped again. 77, 78, 79. However, unfortunately for him, there was still no membrane, no tremor, no resistance, not even the faintest hum of the fourth dimension pushing back against him. Just empty, smooth passage. And that was when the cold truth began to slip into him like a blade through cloth. No, this spacing is wrong. The gaps are never this long. They cannot be this long. He pressed his aura forward, sweeping it through the tunnel in a wide arc, searching and almost begging for even a whisper of temporal friction, but all he felt was nothing. A perfect void. Too perfect. Too clean. His pulse spiked as Multherac's warnings resurfaced with crushing clarity. If you sense no temporal walls, you are no longer in a tunnel. You are drifting toward the endless void, a place with no exits, no cracks, no return. The old dragon had warned. As Leo froze, the slope under his feet shifting subtly, almost imperceptibly, tilting downward into a deeper curvature that was unmistakable to anyone who had studied the fourth dimension for weeks on end. This was the pull he had been told to fear. This was the current that swallowed Wanderers whole. Damn it. I must have tilted the angle too deep, too sharp. Something is wrong. This is not the vector I calculated. He thought, as his breath quickened as he spun around sharply, trying to catch even a faint echo of his last safe point, but the tunnel behind him had already begun to lose its structure, the walls dissolving into a pale, shifting haze. Fuck, he thought, as he took a step back, only for the ground beneath him to drop another fraction. Fuck, he thought, as a silent merciless suction began dragging him forward into a region where even time refused to exist. No, this is the void slope, this is the void. Leo whispered as his heartbeat thundered against the inside of his skull, the realization tearing through him with brutal finality as he realized that he had made a clinical mistake somewhere, and that at this moment, he was now barreling straight toward the endless void. Chapter 865 Overwhelming Loneliness. Within the endless void, Leo's POV. I must find a way out, or I'm doomed, Leo thought as he forced his breathing to slow, even while his heart thundered violently against his ribs, because panic here would not merely cloud his judgment but actively accelerate his death. He tightened the aura shield around his mind, reinforcing it layer by layer, as he pushed his aura dagger outward in a wide, deliberate sweep, searching desperately for even the faintest trace of temporal resistance that could confirm he was still inside a structured tunnel and not drifting freely into something far worse. However, unfortunately for him, nothing answered. The space around him felt unnervingly smooth, not empty in the way a corridor lacked furniture, but empty in the way meaning itself had been stripped away, as though the fourth dimension had erased the concept of walls altogether and replaced it with a gentle, merciless slope that drew everything forward without effort or sound. The entry tear should still exist, Leo thought as he forced his aura outward again, retracing his path in reverse, trying to remember the exact stance of his foot, the precise rotation of his wrist, the intention behind the vector he had carved into the membrane, as he desperately searched for any disturbance he could latch on. However, although he remembered confidence, the ease, the slice of his hand that should have carved 31.45 degrees, what he could not find was any spatial disturbance. I am doomed, Leo thought, as he clenched his jaw and took a second step back, then a third, then a fourth, moving slowly enough that he could have stopped at any moment, because the first rule Multheric had drilled into him was simple. You do not run inside the fourth dimension unless you want to die. Yet even as Leo stepped back, the slope beneath him did not rise, it did not lead him toward safety, but rather continued to pull downward as if the tunnel itself had forgotten it ever had an exit. What now? He wondered, as he stopped moving for half a breath, forcing himself to instead test a different approach, where he swept his aura outward and upward like a net, trying to catch the faintest ripple of the path he had previously carved, because if the tunnel walls were dissolving, then maybe there were remnants, maybe there were scars left in the fabric. However, unfortunately, all he found once again was absolute smoothness. A smoothness so perfect that it felt hostile. I might die, Leo thought as his pulse slammed harder, his stomach sinking with the weight of it, as the panic finally began to creep in. He took another step back, then another, as he counted in his mind. The way Multheric had taught him, not because the numbers mattered anymore, but because counting was the only thing that kept the panic from swallowing him whole. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yet the deeper he stepped, the more the void around him seemed to thin, as the strange colors that once flickered at the edge of his vision began fading into pale gray, and even that gray began to feel like it was stretching apart, as though reality itself was losing cohesion. What if I cannot find it? He finally wondered, as his breathing became faster and faster. The idea landed quietly, like a drop of poison in a clear cup, as it did not scream or shout, but simply existed, and the moment it existed, it began multiplying. What if there was no way back? What if he had tilted too deep, and the tunnel he opened was not a tunnel at all, but a slide into the endless void that Multheric had warned him about repeatedly? Is this where I die? Leo thought as his chest tightened. He knew very well that the void did not need to kill him quickly, only keep him, and hence, he took another careful step backward, his aura dagger stabbing outward again and again, as he tried to find friction, tried to find a wall, tried to find anything that proved this space still obeyed the rules he had spent months learning. However, unfortunately, despite his desperate prayers, he still found nothing. As it was at this moment that his mind finally began to betray him with something worse than fear, as it painted him a cruel picture of Amanda. Not the blacksmith Amanda, not the genius inventor Amanda, but the Amanda who smiled when she thought nobody was looking, the Amanda who held their children with tired arms and stubborn pride. If I'm not around, what happens to my kids, and Amanda? Leo wondered as the image sharpened in his mind, giving him a full-blown panic attack. He saw Amanda running. He saw Amanda hiding. He saw her raising 2 children alone in the shadows, as Elena had once raised him and Luke. However, this time there was no earth, no peace, no quiet planet to call home, no chance to breathe. They would be hunted relentlessly, Leo thought as his throat burned. He knew very well that the righteous faction would never let anyone with confirmed timeless assassin bloodline live a long life, and hence, he knew for sure that they would hunt Amanda and the kids down, no matter how long it took. He imagined his children growing up watching the sky with fear, learning to duck before they learned to laugh, learning to lie before they learned to read, as his vision blurred for a fraction of a second and the loneliness started to press closer. What happens to my friends, my family and the cult? Leo thought as he tried to steady his breathing again, only to fail miserably again. He pictured Ver in chains, the execution drawing nearer, as he pictured himself not arriving, not saving him, not even dying in battle like a warrior, but fading into nothing in a place nobody could reach. They would never even find my body. Leo thought as the loneliness sharpened its grip, the fourth dimension stripping away his comfort, his certainty, and the sense that anyone else existed at all, as the loneliness attacked him in a way that nothing had ever attacked him before. It wrapped around his thoughts, whispering that there was nothing outside this place, that everyone he loved was a fabrication, a story invented to cope. No. Hold it together. Leo thought as he layered his aura shield again and again, because Multheric had warned him what happened when the void touched the mind directly. As even shielded, he could feel it. A pressure, a whisper, a suggestion. Step. He took another step back. Then another. Yet the slope steepened, and the panic sharpened, because the rational part of his mind reached a conclusion he did not want to admit just yet. I may have already passed the point of return, Leo thought as his heart hammered, the inevitability of his situation settling into him, as his vision began to dissolve into a pale, shifting haze. He tried to twist his vector, to carve a new weak point, but without walls, without membranes, without rhythm, he had nothing to strike. As he felt like he was swimming in the air, or digging into fog. Is this really it? The end of my adventure? Leo thought as his mind flashed again to Amanda, to his children, to himself as he ruled over the universe. Before even those thoughts began to dissolve into a hopeless, endless black, as he began to lose all hope. What a fucking disgrace. I really thought I would amount to more. Leo thought, as just when he started to lose all hope, the smooth gray Space ahead of him twitched. Swoosh. A line appeared. Thin. Violent. Wrong in a way that felt right, as reality split open with brutal authority, a spatial tear ripping through the void as pressure slammed into his aura shield hard enough to make it ring. Who? He muttered in surprise, as from that tear, something massive surged forward. Ancient. Dominant. Familiar. As Multheric emerged with a disapproving frown etched on his face. Chapter 866 Back. Within the endless void, Leo's POV. Multheric came charging into the void with a frown etched deeply on his face, as the smooth, merciless slope of the endless expanse attempted to drag even his massive form forward, the fourth dimension recoiling violently at his intrusion while ancient pressure radiated from his scales and forced reality itself to bend around him instead. "The boy is under my protection," he declared, as his golden eyes locked onto Leo's drifting figure, the words carrying authority rather than sound, which seemed to enrage the void as its silent pull intensified in direct response to his defiance. FSSHH. The void strained harder, the entry tear behind Multheric, threatening to flicker and collapse as invisible forces tried to force him to turn back, yet he did not yield even a fraction, his claws slicing directly into the fabric of space as if it were something tangible rather than an untouchable dimension. FSSHH. Crash. Despite the danger and the void's resistance, Multheric forced his aura to slam outward in an absolute declaration of ownership, flooding the surrounding expanse with a presence so ancient and dominant that even the fourth dimension hesitated, its featureless smoothness rippling as though struck by a sudden, violent storm. Boom. Step. Little by little, Multheric surged forward, his movements patient and measured, until his aura wrapped around Leo's body and anchored him firmly, at which point he turned and began to flee instead, dragging Leo back against the merciless slope. FSHHHHH. Asterisk. Tremble. The realm trembled as the void resisted. For a fleeting moment, its slope steepened further, and Leo felt the loneliness claw at him one final time, whispering that this rescue was an illusion, that nothing truly existed beyond this place, that letting go would be easier. However, before he could believe those sweet lies, Multheric shattered the sensation with a roar, a dragon's call that tore through all four dimensions before reaching him. RAAAWWWRRR. Thrum. Leo's eyes widened in acknowledgement, as he felt his identity return to him in a sudden jolt, as although he had started to forget, there was something primal in that roar, something ancient and grounding, something that pierced straight through his wavering mind, that reminded him of who he was, and that he had dragon in his blood. Kaboom! At that very moment, thankfully for him, the tear detonated outward as Multheric dragged him backward through it, the fourth dimension screaming in absolute silence as it was denied its prey, as he made it back to the three-dimensional world instead. Crash! The colors returned in a violent rush as he slammed onto solid stone and the spatial tear sealed behind him. "We are back," Multheric said, as from the texture of the stone beneath him he could sense that they were back on the floating island. Back inside the stilled world. However, the moment he realized that they were back, the aura shield that had protected him until now shattered, the impact driving every last breath from his lungs, as his body folded in on itself on instinct, while his fingers clawed weakly at the surface beneath him like someone who had nearly forgotten what solidity felt like. Stone. Cold. Real. Those sensations crashed into him all at once, overwhelming in their simplicity, yet unbelievably complex nonetheless, as his chest convulsed violently while he coughed and gasped, his vision swimming as the echo of the void still clung to the edges of his thoughts, refusing to release him entirely despite having been torn away from it. Tremble. Shiver. His limbs trembled uncontrollably as he curled tighter, pressing his forehead against the ground as if anchoring himself through contact alone, because even now, even here, part of his mind insisted that this too was a lie, another illusion waiting to dissolve, as despite his best efforts to brush the sensation off, the loneliness still lingered. Thankfully, it wasn't as loud as before. Not as suffocating either, but present nonetheless, like a shadow that had memorized the shape of his soul and refused to leave quietly, whispering that the silence would return the moment he closed his eyes. Fuck, I could have died," Leo muttered, as he forced his breathing to slow. In, out, each breath felt stolen, dragged from somewhere deep and reluctant, as though his body had not yet accepted that survival was real and not merely a delayed sentence. As above him, a massive presence loomed. Multheric stood there for several long seconds, his towering shadow swallowing Leo whole as his golden eyes studied the trembling figure on the stone, not with anger, not with relief, but with a deep, quiet disappointment that cut far sharper than any reprimand ever could. Leo did not look up. He could not. His entire focus remained fixed on fighting the residual pull of the void, on resisting the temptation to let his thoughts drift back into that smooth, endless nothing where effort ceased to matter and loneliness reigned absolute. As after observing him for a while, Multheric turned away, his heavy steps echoing across the floating island as he walked back toward the central chamber, wings folding slowly against his sides, as he ensured that the sound of his retreat was deliberate and unhurried, as though he knew that nothing he said now would help more than the silence he left behind. Tremble, shiver. Leo remained where he was. Alone, curled against the cold stone. Shaking. As minutes passed first, then hours. Time crawled forward in fragments as Leo lay there, fighting wave after wave of intrusive emptiness, as he gripped the ground tight whenever memories of smoothness and endless slope tried to resurface, as he reminded himself again and again that the stone beneath him was real, that the sky above him existed, that meaning still had weight. As a full 24 hours later, only when the trembling finally began to fade, long after the echoes of Multherac's footsteps had vanished, did Leo manage to unclench his fingers from the island's surface, the imprint of his grip still etched faintly into the stone, and stand back up, as he dusted himself off and walked towards the central chamber to greet Multheric, with his head once again raised high. Chapter 867 Leo's True Desire. Multherac's floating island, central chamber, Leo's POV. Push. Crack. The doors to Multherac's central chamber were forced open with a sharp, echoing crack as Leo shoved them apart without hesitation, the heavy stone panels groaning in protest as they scraped along the floor, announcing his arrival with the same raw aggression that had always marked his presence long before he ever learned to fear the fourth dimension. Multheric, who had been standing near the center of the chamber with his back turned, paused mid-motion as the sound reached him, one massive brow lifting slightly as he turned his head just enough to look over his shoulder, his golden eyes immediately locking onto Leo with quiet appraisal. "Took you long enough to get back on your feet, boy," Multheric said, as his voice echoed calmly through the chamber while his gaze swept over Leo from head to toe, taking in the steadiness of his stance and the tension coiled tightly beneath his skin. Leo did not respond. He stepped fully into the chamber instead, the doors slamming shut behind him as he came to a stop several paces in, his spine straight and his chin raised, as he met Multherac's gaze without the slightest hint of avoidance, as though the past 24 hours had burned something raw and unyielding into him rather than breaking him down. Multheric turned to face him properly then, his massive form shifting as he folded his wings closer to his body, as he studied Leo with a sharper intensity than before, the faint disappointment from earlier now layered beneath something colder and more deliberate. "Make sure you did not leave your balls back there where you were shivering in the void," Multheric said, as his tone sharpened just enough to cut. "Come enter my chamber properly once you have retrieved them." The insult hung in the air, as Leo's jaw tightened. His fists clenched slowly at his sides, the muscles in his forearms drawing taut as something deep within him stirred, not explosive or wild, but controlled and lethal, like a blade being drawn inch by inch rather than ripped free. He did not speak. Instead, he unfurled his killing intent as the chamber responded instantly. The air grew heavy, pressure slamming outward from his body in a sharp, suffocating wave as the stone beneath his feet trembled faintly, hairline cracks spreading across the floor in slow, crawling lines while the runes etched into the chamber walls flickered in response to the sudden surge. It was cold, not frantic, not emotional. Just pure, sharpened intent. The kind that proved that he still had his courage about himself. However, despite his brave display, Multheric did not move, the ancient dragon simply watching without expression, as he looked unamused. "Thrum." Leo intensified his aura, as if unwilling to take Multherac's "no" for an answer, as he pushed his aura pressure to its limits, and maintained it there for several heartbeats longer, until the entire chamber began to groan softly under the strain. *BZZTTRRRR. It was only at this moment that Leo began to slowly draw it back in, the killing intent receding into him like a blade sliding back into its sheath, as silence returned to the chamber once again. Multheric mused, as he nodded once. Good, it seems like the void has not completely broken your spirit just yet, Multheric said, as his voice lowered and grew heavier with meaning. You are very fortunate indeed. Leo's fists remained clenched. His teeth ground together quietly as the words sank in, not as praise, not as comfort, but as a reminder of just how close he had come to losing everything, as well as how thin the line truly was between strength and oblivion. He did not thank Multheric. He did not bow. He simply stood there, shoulders squared and eyes burning cold, his silence louder than any retort he could have offered as Multheric studied him with a complicated gaze. Whatever happened, boy. If you don't want to relive it again, make sure you never take space tunneling casually again. It's not a child's play technique. I thought I already made that clear when I first taught it to you. Multheric guided, as Leo softly nodded in understanding. He had made a mistake by growing too lax. And it was a mistake that he had paid dearly for. The void had messed with his mind in ways the normal universe never could, and the experience had left him with much to process. If you don't want to continue learning how to navigate a space tunnel, then I can respect that. Dragons with much stronger minds than you have crumbled after just glimpsing at the void, much less falling into it. However, if you still wish to master it, then you need to get back with it right away. For the longer you let the fear build inside you, the stronger it will get. Multheric questioned, as he gave Leo two choices. Leo could either choose to continue learning how to space tunnel or quit, and while Multheric could understand and respect both choices, he expected Leo to still continue learning nonetheless. I have to learn, damn it. Leo responded, his voice trembling with an untamable fury as he clenched his fists till his knuckles whitened. I have to learn. I have to win. I have to become the strongest in the universe. For nothing else, nothing at all, will ever make me feel complete, he said while emphasizing each word, as Multheric's eyes widened in disbelief. Having passed through the void, one often realized what made them feel whole as an individual. For some it was family. For some it was respect. For some it was revenge. However, for Leo it was the desire to become the strongest, which was a trait reserved for overlords. The types of individuals who would accept nothing less than their total dominance over everything there was to conquer. Ha 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 ha. Multheric chuckled, slowly at first, and then increasingly louder, as he finally realized just what sort of a man Leo Skyshard was at his core. A man whose existence revolved not around fear or loss, but around the need to stand above all else. Chapter 868 Conquering Fear. The time-stilled world, Multheric's floating island, Leo's POV. Exhale. Leo let out a slow, deliberate breath as he stood once again at the edge of the floating island, the stilled ocean stretching endlessly before him, its unmoving surface reflecting a sky that never changed, while behind him stood Multheric with his wings folded, the dragon's ancient presence heavy enough that he could feel it without turning around. Remember this, boy, Multheric said, as his voice carried calmly but without warmth. I was able to save you last time only because I traced the exact path you took before you slipped into the void. He paused for just long enough to let the words settle. I cannot guarantee that I will be able to repeat that feat again, Multheric continued, as his tone hardened. If you falter once more and find yourself drifting into the void again, the chances are high that you will die a brutal death this time. Leo felt his hand tremble at the warning, a faint but undeniable shake that ran through his fingers as the memory of smooth gray nothingness stirred in his mind, bringing with it the echo of silence and the weightless pull that had nearly swallowed him whole. He understood now, not just intellectually, but viscerally. He understood why space tunneling was not a common method of travel in the modern universe, or why it was reserved only for those reckless enough to gamble their existence on precision alone, because the technique demanded perfection from beings who were still capable of negligence and fear. Do not let the fear of failure consume you, Multheric said, as he fixed his gaze on Leo's trembling hand. Fight it now, before it grows into something worse. His voice sharpened. I can see your hand shaking, and if you do not conquer that fear here, at this very moment, it will only get tougher and tougher from here onwards. He warned, as Leo closed his eyes briefly and drew in another breath, this one deeper than the last, as he forced his thoughts into alignment. I can do this, Leo thought as he forced himself to acknowledge the fear rather than deny it. as he tightened his grip and commanded his muscles to obey him instead of his instincts. "Calm down," he urged, as thankfully, little by little, the tremor started to fade and his fingers started to steady. "All right, here I go," he muttered, as he tilted the aura dagger with deliberate care, committing the precise angle he needed to slash into muscle memory once more, as he practiced slashing at precisely 31.45 degrees 100 times before opening the actual tunnel. Slash. FSSHHH. The fabric of space tore open as the tunnel formed, reality warping immediately around the incision as colors twisted unnaturally and depth folded in on itself, creating an opening that felt both familiar and terrifying. Thump thump. His heart began to pound harder as he stared at the tunnel, the memory of the void clawing at the back of his mind while doubt whispered that one wrong step would drag him back into that smooth, endless descent, as for a fraction of a second, his legs resisted. "What if you fail again?" A voice whispered in his head. However, instead of listening to it, Leo clenched his fists in anger. "Move," he muttered to himself, as he struck his thigh sharply and forced his body to obey. "If you want to be the strongest, if you want to save there, then you don't get to hesitate here," he said, motivating himself, as despite the fear still coiling tightly in his chest, he stepped forward once more, entering the space tunnel again not because the fear was gone, but because he refused to let it decide his fate a second time. Step step. The slope formed beneath his feet exactly as calculated, neither too steep nor too shallow, as the tunnel curved smoothly forward instead of collapsing inward. As he moved without hesitation, his aura dagger already raised, his posture aligned, his focus narrowed to a single point of intent. Slash. The first temporal membrane parted cleanly as it offered the familiar tremor of resistance through which he advanced immediately, as he refused to allow his thoughts to wander or memory to intrude, as he committed fully to the rhythm Multheric had drilled into him. Slash. Another membrane gave way at precisely the same angle, 31.45 degrees, as the slope maintained its stability while the tunnel extended forward like a blade cut through silk. Slash. Slash. Dot. Slash. He did not rush as urgency tempted him forward, nor did he slow as doubt threatened to creep in, choosing instead to move within the cadence he had forged, as he refused to count aloud or let numbers dominate his thoughts, as he instead relied on instinct, repetition, and the power of his subconscious mind which tracked exactly how far along he was on the path. Step step. Membrane after membrane parted beneath his strikes as each one met the dagger at the same perfect angle, responding with the same measured resistance, while Leo advanced deeper without deviation, without tremor, without allowing the memory of the void to surface again, as he faced no emptiness this time, no sudden descent, no loss of structure, only walls, only rhythm, only purpose. His aura shield remained steady around his mind as cosmic pressure brushed against it repeatedly, testing but never overwhelming, while his focus remained absolute, so complete that even the sensation of distance began to lose meaning, replaced instead by the certainty that he was moving exactly where he intended to go. Eventually, the membranes began to thin as resistance shifted beneath his perception, while the slope eased just enough for him to recognize the change instantly. The exit vector responded. The tunnel brightened ahead, as without hesitation or pause, Leo slashed through the final membrane as the fourth dimension split apart one last time, releasing him back into three-dimensional space. FSHHH. Land. Light returned as gravity reclaimed him, sound rushing back while planet Ixtal's air filled his lungs, the weight of reality settling fully around him as his boots struck solid ground in a controlled landing. He did not stumble. He did not falter. He stood still for a single breath, eyes sweeping the horizon as a soft smile played out on his lips. "I did it. I actually did it," he mused, as he felt a huge psychological barrier lifting off his back. Chapter 869 Arriving at Ixtal. Planet Ixtal, Soren's POV. Soren lay submerged up to his chest in a wide basin carved from dark stone, the surface of the herbal bath rippling faintly as warm steam curled upward and clung to the vaulted ceiling, while crushed leaves, roots, and glowing petals drifted lazily through the water, their medicinal scent thick enough to sting his nose as his battered body slowly absorbed their restorative essence. His eyes remained half-closed as he rested there, one arm draped over the edge of the basin, his breathing slow and uneven, as though even stillness demanded effort from him now. "If there is one thing I will miss about life, it's these warm baths," he thought, as he submerged himself deeper into the water surface now rising up to his nose, as he rested there to momentarily forget the pain of his scars. Ripple. Asterisk. The water stirred. Soren's eyes opened. Not fully at first, just enough for awareness to sharpen, as something brushed against the edges of his perception, faint and uncertain, like a shadow that had not existed a moment ago. Then it solidified. A presence. There. Abrupt. Complete. As though it had skipped the space in between. Soren's fingers tightened against the stone rim as his senses surged outward instinctively, retracing the flow of mana across the planet, across the skies, across the layered currents of reality itself, while his heartbeat thudded once, heavy and disbelieving. Impossible. Soren muttered, as his brows knit together and his gaze lifted toward the open skylight above the chamber, steam parting around his face as he focused harder, because he knew with absolute certainty that Leo's skyshard had not been there 1 moment ago. There had been no approach. No gradual encroachment. No ripple of movement. One breath there was nothing. The next, Leo existed on Ixtal. And from his many years existing as a god, he knew for sure that was not how space worked. Unless. His chest tightened suddenly, and he coughed, the sound rough and involuntary, as pain flared beneath his ribs, forcing him to brace himself against the basin's edge, as droplets splashed outward while the herbal water churned around him. Have my senses begun to betray me already? Soren asked quietly, as he steadied his breathing with effort, or has Skyshard become something beyond my expectations? The thought lingered, heavy and unsettling, as he leaned forward slightly, shoulders tensing, while the realization took shape in his mind with chilling clarity. There was only one way a presence could appear like that. Only one method that ignored distance entirely. Which was traveling through the fourth dimension. Huff. Soren exhaled slowly, sinking back into the bath as the steam swallowed him again, a faint, weary smile tugging at the corner of his lips despite the ache in his body. So you've learned to walk through forbidden paths already, he murmured, as another cough shook him and left him momentarily breathless. That eases my mind slightly. No, that eases my mind a lot. His fingers curled slightly beneath the water, his gaze distant now, as hope and concern twisted together inside his chest. I don't know how much longer this body of mine will hold out, and in you I finally see a worthy successor. He murmured, as he closed his eyes again, and waited for Leo to eventually approach his castle doors. Meanwhile, Dumpy, Amanda, Supay and the kids. Caleb darted past the low stone benches with a laugh, his feet barely touching the ground as Myron chased after him with wild determination, the two children weaving around each other in clumsy arcs as their game of tag spilled across the open clearing, their voices echoing brightly against the distant cliffs while the sky above remained calm and blue, betraying nothing of the forces moving through it. No fair, Big Brother cheated. Myron shouted, as he lunged forward and nearly tripped, only to catch himself at the last second before bursting into laughter again. I did not, you're just slow. Caleb replied, as he skidded to a stop behind Amanda and stuck his tongue out triumphantly, using her as a temporary shield. Amanda sighed softly, though the corner of her lips curved upward. Despite herself, as she rested one hand on Caleb's shoulder and gently nudged him back toward the open space. Careful, she said, as her eyes never stopped tracking both children at once. If either of you fall again, you're done playing for the day. Yes, yes, Caleb groaned dramatically, as he broke free and ran again, the game resuming without pause. A short distance away, Dumpy sat with his legs tucked beneath him, his wide body still as stone while his gaze remained unfocused, as though he were listening to something no one else could hear, while beside him Supay leaned back against a smooth slab of rock, arms crossed loosely as he watched the children with a quiet, guarded expression. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Dumpy smiled. It was not his usual mild curve of amusement, nor the faint politeness he sometimes forced when conversation demanded it, but a broad, unrestrained grin that split his face wide open, stretching from cheek to cheek with a joy so sudden and so genuine that it seemed almost out of place on him. Supay noticed immediately. What happened? Supay asked, as he turned his head sharply to look at Dumpy. What's funny? Dumpy did not answer right away. Instead, he scoffed softly, shaking his head as though disappointed, his eyes lifting slowly toward the open sky above them. What? Supay pressed, as confusion crept into his tone. Care to tell me what it is? I'm curious, because since we've been together, I don't think I've seen you smile even once like that. But now you're grinning, ear to ear. Dumpy finally looked at him then, the joy in his expression undiminished. He's here, Dumpy said simply, as his voice carried a quiet certainty that made Su Pei's spine stiffen. Lord Father, my master, is here, he said with reverence, as Su Pei froze. His gaze snapped upward instantly as he spread his senses outward in reflex, mana unfurling like a net cast into the sky, searching, probing, reaching farther and farther than he normally dared. And then he felt it. A presence descending at terrifying speed. Focused, unmistakable, overwhelmingly familiar. Su Pei stood up at once, his posture straightening into rigid attention. As shock flickered across his face, his eyes locked on a distant point in the heavens where the air itself seemed to tremble. He really is, Su Pei muttered, as his breath caught in his throat. The shadow dragon had returned to Ixtal. Chapter 870 Holding his kids. Planet Ixtal, Leo's POV. Leo looked down at his family from the sky, his descent slow and gentle, as he deliberately restrained every instinct within him that urged speed or dominance, because more than anything else in this moment, he needed Amanda and the children to understand that he was no longer a threat to their lives. He kept his aura compressed so tightly that not even a whisper of pressure escaped him, as the air parted around his body without turbulence, while the ground beneath him rose steadily closer with calm inevitability rather than force. "Babe, I'm back," he muttered softly, the words intended more for himself than anyone else, as his eyes never left the small figures below. Shriek. Amanda shrieked in joy the instant she saw him, her expression turning to one of pure elation as she did not wait a second longer and began running toward where he would land. Land. Tackle. The moment his boots touched the ground, Amanda crashed into him with all the force of her relief, as she wrapped all four limbs around him without hesitation. "Ha ha ha, I love you too." Leo chuckled as he staggered half a step before catching her easily, his arms coming around her with instinctive care, as he held her tightly yet precisely, acutely aware of every point of contact, every shift of her weight, every heartbeat pounding against his chest, as he took extreme care to not hurt her by accident. "Welcome back, love," Amanda murmured, her voice breaking as she buried her face against his shoulder, tears soaking into his clothes as weeks of fear, anger, and sleepless nights finally found release all at once. Huff. Leo exhaled slowly, his forehead resting against hers as he closed his eyes for just a moment and grounded himself in the warmth of her body, as he reassured himself that he was truly here and not lost to the void. "I'm here," Leo said quietly, as his fingers tightened slightly against Amanda's back. "And I can be around the kids now," he declared, as Amanda pulled back just enough to look at him, her hands cupping his face as she studied him carefully, as if searching for something she could not quite name. Until the realization suddenly struck and her eyes widened. "Your aura," Amanda said, disbelief flickering across her expression. "It's gone." "No, it's still there, but it's not hurting anymore." "You finally learned how to control it?" she asked, as Leo gave her a gentle, loving smile. "I did," Leo replied, as his gaze drifted past her shoulder and towards the children. Caleb stood frozen a short distance away, his small hands clenched nervously at his sides as he stared up at Leo with wide, uncertain eyes, while beside him, Myron tilted his head back with open curiosity, squinting slightly as if trying to decide whether the man in front of him truly matched the image he carried in his heart. He muttered, tapping his chin, as he deliberated Leo's identity for a while before suddenly pointing towards him. "Look, Caleb, a flying man that looks like Dada," Myron said, his voice filled with innocent awe as Leo's chest tightened at his words. "My own kids aren't even sure if I'm their dad. How pathetic am I?" he wondered, as Amanda followed his gaze and smiled through her tears as she gently turned toward the children. "Come on over," Amanda nudged softly, holding out one hand toward them. "It's Dada," she encouraged, as the children hesitated at first, before eventually moving. Caleb took a careful step forward, then stopped again, his eyes flicking between Leo and Amanda as though silently asking permission, while Myron threw caution straight into the wind as he jumped straight into Leo's arms. "Yay, Dada!" Myron yelped, as Leo barely had time to react before a small body collided with his chest, arms wrapping around his neck as laughter burst against his ear, as for the first time in his life, Leo felt what it meant to hold his child. Lub dub lub dub. His heart thudded against his ears as he froze. How soft and light, he thought, as slowly, reverently, he wrapped his arms around Myron, holding him with a care so unnatural to his usual self that it almost felt like he was handling glass. Step, step. Caleb approached next, step by cautious step, until he reached Leo, as he lifted his arms. Halfway, feeling uncertain, as though he did not fully believe the hug was allowed, his small fingers curling inward as he hesitated at the last step. However, unlike him, Leo knelt without hesitation and opened his embrace, lowering himself to Caleb's height so the boy would not feel swallowed by him, as he made his posture smaller and gentler than it had ever been in battle or command. Hug. The moment both children were against him, Leo felt something inside him give way completely, as the weight of their small bodies settled into his arms, their warmth grounding him in a way no throne, no power, no victory ever had, as though the universe itself had narrowed to this single point of contact. They are so small, so soft, so weak, if I apply even a little bit of force they can die, Leo thought as he became acutely aware of every breath they took, every fragile rise and fall of their chests, yet even though they are so fragile, holding them brings me so much joy. He realized as he felt the joy of parenthood for the first time ever. Caleb, Myron, my kids, he muttered, as in that moment he swore that from this second onward, no matter what stood in his way, no matter what the universe demanded of him, he would protect them forever. For with this single embrace, which was their first interaction ever, Leo understood how this was the moment every father spoke about in hushed, reverent tones. Not the battles, not the conquests, not the victories written into history, but this single instant where the world narrowed to the weight of a child in one's arms, as something irreversible settled into the soul and quietly rewrote every priority that had ever existed. Leo had heard others describe it before, men who claimed that the first time they held their newborns in sterile hospital rooms surrounded by white lights and beeping machines, something fundamental shifted inside them, as if the universe itself had leaned in and whispered that life would never again belong to them alone. However, he had never understood it. Not until now. Not until he held Caleb and Myron against his chest, feeling their uneven breathing against his neck and their small hands gripping his clothes with unconscious trust. For it was at this moment that he felt that same invisible line being crossed, as though the man he had been a moment ago had been sealed behind him forever, and in his place there stood a father. These are my kids, my blood, Leo thought as pride surged through him in a way that felt almost violent, as he softly ruffled their hair and noticed the tiny details that made them real, as Caleb's hair lay smooth just like his Uncle Luke's while Myron's curls mirrored his own, as though the universe itself had stamped his legacy into them without asking permission. These kids are the living proof of my love with Amanda, Leo thought as he finally understood that they were not mere extensions of his strength, but the reason behind it, and in that realization something far more dangerous than ambition took root inside him, something quieter, deeper, and infinitely more unyielding, as he understood with terrifying clarity that the universe could take his throne, his power, even his life, but it would never be allowed to touch them. Not his kids. Not now. Not ever. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.